Coming up, the most notorious Appalachian outlaws in history come to life, and there is no crime they won't commit and no man that can stop them. This is Appalachia's Deadliest, the top 10 outlaws. Number 10. A crime so brutal and shocking that the state of Tennessee executed 4 men in the span of 32 minutes. On March 1st, 1922, the state of Tennessee set the record for the most people executed in the electric chair in a single day. 4 men were strapped into the chair named Old Smoky, one at a time, and they were executed in the span of 32 minutes. Over 100 years later, this record still hasn't been broken. But what did these men do that was so gruesome that they deserved this cruel fate? It's a story that shocked the nation in 1921. Resulting in one of the largest manhunts in American history, and it happened right here in Appalachia. It's a heck of a story that's nearly been lost to time. Hold on to your hats and buckle up for this one, folks. Andrew Crumley was a simple man. He worked for a taxi service in Knoxville, Tennessee. In the late afternoon of May 30, 1921, 2 well-dressed men in their 20s approached him to negotiate a taxi ride. Now, Crumley didn't know it, but this ride was about to forever change his life and American history. Unknown to Crumley, the selection of his taxicab was not random. The 2 men were specifically looking for a big and powerful car to employ. Crumley's car was perfect, the Chandler 6, with its large 7-passenger seating capacity, a powerful, fast engine that was advertised with the benefits of handling steep grades in mud or sand. It made it the perfect getaway vehicle. Crumley and the 2 men agreed on the fare, $3 an hour for city roads and $3.50 an hour for county roads. As soon as the taxi pulled out, the men told Crumley they wanted to stop at a place called Clinton, Tennessee first. Then they would continue 5.5 or 6 miles further, offering no specific location. Crumley, he grew suspicious that the men wanted to pick up illegal moonshine, and he told the men he didn't want to have any part of that, especially since Prohibition was in its first year, and the penalty for illegal booze was 1 year in jail and a fine equivalent of $60,000 in today's money. The 2 men assured him that their trip had nothing to do with illegal bootleg liquor. Crumley agreed to continue, but as a precaution, he was going to swing by a boarding house where he lived to pick up one of his closest friends. Crumley explained to the men that he wanted the company for the late drive back to Knoxville. Heck, the roads during that time were difficult to navigate. Only a few of them were paved, and none of them had street lights. So, Crumley stopped and he picked up his friend George Lewis, who climbed into the front seat with Crumley and the 2 strangers in the back seat. Together, the 4 men set out to the White Hotel in Clinton. Once they arrived, one of the men in the back seat named McClure got out of the taxi saying he'd be back in just a moment. There were 2 men, Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas, waiting on the front porch of the hotel. Within a few minutes, the men loaded their luggage into the taxi and they were on their way. But where to? They still hadn't told Crumley exactly where he was going. Now there were 4 strangers seated in the back of the car, and they told Crumley they wanted to drive into the country. Crumley pulled away from the hotel just as the sun was setting, and he was given turn-by-turn instructions to some unknown destination. As the trip continued, there was talk and laughter. The four men seemed to be enjoying themselves in the back of the taxi, and Crumley and Lewis, they were having fun up front. Crumley still wasn't exactly sure where the men wanted to go, but the relaxed environment of the car alleviated any further suspicions or concerns. After driving about 12 miles, one of the men yelled from behind, "Stop the car! I think this is the place." Petrie got out of the car and he looked around. But apparently he didn't recognize the location and he hollered, "No." Petrie then stepped onto the running board of the car and he told Crumley to continue a little further. At this point, Crumley was certain that they were looking for a moonshine still. After driving a short distance, Crumley was told to stop again. Petrie went in the front of the car to look around and he asked Crumley if he saw a trail going off the road. Crumley replied that he didn't, when all of a sudden, he heard from the back seat, "Get your hands up." Confused and stricken with fear, Crumley and Lewis immediately complied without looking to see who was issuing the order. Crumley was sure that it was a local sheriff who was making an arrest due to the illegal nature of their stop, which in his mind was the location of a moonshine still. Crumley began to plead his case to the imagined sheriff. "I ain't done nothing. I got a taxi badge here showing that I'm a driver from Knoxville." He also added that his friend was innocent too, explaining that Lewis was only along for the ride. When he was finished speaking, there was dead silence. Crumley, realizing that nobody was responding, mustered the courage to look over his shoulder to see who had issued the command. As Crumley turned, he heard the voice say again, "Hold your hands up." At that moment, Crumley realized that there was no sheriff, as all four men pointed their pistols at Crumley and Lewis's heads. Both men were ordered to get out of the car, and their hands were tied behind their backs. The four strangers began searching through Crumley's pockets. They found his Army discharge papers, a taxi badge, $2 or $3, several letters, and a New Testament Bible. Nervously, Crumley began begging, "If you want this car, men, I don't know what this is all about. But anyway, if it's the car you want, just take it. You can drive right off and I won't object. Spare my life. I have a wife and a baby at home." One of the men responded in a condescending, snide way, "You'll see your wife and babies all right." Crumley continued his nervous rambling when one of the men put a gun in his face and said, "Shut up, or I'll blow your damn head off." Crumley complied as the two men were led by a flashlight up a hill towards a very dark and secluded wooded area on the top of a ridge called Black Oak Ridge. Once they reached the top of the ridge, they approached a large, deep gravel pit that was about 50 feet in diameter and had an ominous sinkhole appearance that looked like a crater. The four bandits tied the men up with trout line. Crumley's hands were throbbing from the tightness as the trout line began cutting into his flesh. They gagged Lewis and Crumley with a towel that was held in place by a piece of trout line wrapped several times around their head. Suddenly, the mood of the men changed. They began to sadistically taunt Crumley and Lewis with threats like, "How do you feel now?" and "If you move, we'll blow your brains out." After they finished tying up the pair, Petrie took Crumley's hat off his head and he said, "Let him have it." Suddenly, one of the men holding a gun hit Crumley in the back of the head with a massive blow. Crumley collapsed to the ground in excruciating pain and he blacked out. Lewis was next. He received 2 or 3 horrifically hard blows to his head, crushing part of his skull. Crumley slowly opened his eyes and he felt that everything that was happening was distant and faint. But he decided in order to survive, he would fake his own death. He heard one of the men ask, "Have you cut him yet?" The reply was, "No, I'm going to now." The next moment must have been horrific. Crumley heard a gurgling noise that sounded like blood running and a squishing sound that he realized was a dull knife ripping through flesh. Crumley looked over at Lewis in time to see one of the men cutting Lewis's throat. Stunned, Crumley felt a footstep on his hand and he heard someone say to the others, "He's dead." Then he heard the terrifying reply, "Cut his damn throat anyhow." Crumley felt a cold hand grab his head and pull his face off the ground as a flashlight was being shined in his face and he felt his throat being sliced open with a metal blade. Then he heard one of the men say, "Wipe off your hands," as the four men started to leave the pit. Lewis, who was laying there dying, began to have a seizure and his leg kicked involuntarily. One of the men heard Lewis's movement and he yelled out, "That son of a bitch ain't dead." Then Crumley, sensing movement around him, heard another ghastly ripping of flesh. And the cold-blooded response, "That'll fix him." Barely conscious, Crumley heard the four men walking out of the pit. The leaves and the twigs were snapping underneath their feet, and the sound faded as they headed in the direction of the car. Knowing it was time to make their escape, Crumley looked over at Lewis, who was clinging to life in a pool of blood. With his hands still tied, Crumley desperately tried to get to his feet, but the blow to his head and the loss of blood made him dizzy. As soon as he got to his feet, he crashed face first back into the sandy gravel. He tried again to stand. He was able to get up on one knee and steady himself, and then he stood straight up. He walked towards his friend. He immediately noticed that Lewis's head was positioned in a disturbingly awkward way. The cut from the double slash was horrific. It must have severed most of his tendons and muscles. Lewis laid there in agony. His head was hinging open at the neck, increasing the savage effect of the double cut. Crumley, feeling compelled to straighten out Lewis's head, eased back down on both knees behind him. He tried to speak through his gag to let Lewis know he was there, and then he used his knee to adjust Lewis's head back in a more normal position. As he desperately tried to straighten out Lewis's head, Crumley heard the unmistakable sound of the death rattle. Lewis's body became motionless. For a moment, Crumley watched his friend, still laying in a pool of blood. He was dead. Terrified, Crumley quickly got to his feet and took one step and fell again. Now desperate, he struggled back to his feet and he climbed as quick as he could out of the pit. His mind began to suspect that the four men would be returning soon to make sure both he and Lewis were dead. With a gag in his mouth and his hands still tied behind his back, he ran through the dark woods, away from the direction that he thought the car would be. After only a few strides, he ran into a barbed wire fence and flipped over the fence. He felt the barbed wire ripping through his body. He knew he couldn't stay there, so he picked himself up and he walked a short distance until he spotted a farmhouse. In the yard of the farmhouse, Crumley was able to use a tree trunk to rub the gag out of his mouth down to his chin. He approached the door of the house and he began kicking and yelling for help.
"Help! Help! Please, please help me, please!"
All that commotion must have frightened the family that was inside, and the person on the other side of the door asked what he wanted. Crumley relayed in detail the tale of terror that he had been through. The owner was thinking it was some kind of a ruse and he refused to open the door, so Crumley was forced to continue searching for help. He soon came upon a main road, and as he was preparing to cross the road, he stopped for a moment and he listened in the dark, quiet woods. He heard what he knew to be the engine of his Chandler 6 roaring nearby, echoing like thunder through the mountains. He was convinced the men had discovered that he had made his escape, and they were searching for him. Terror-stricken, Crumley ran away from the road and back into the woods, running as fast as he could, retracing his steps when suddenly he hit the same barbed wire fence. He didn't flip over the fence this time, but in total agony, he collapsed at the base and he passed out. During his blackout, by some miracle, the gag slid down from his chin to the bleeding wound of his neck, stopping the flow of the blood. Once he regained consciousness, he knew he had to keep moving. He stayed close to the forest line, following an open field, searching for another farmhouse. Crumley's mental state alternated back and forth between desperation and sheer panic. He began having delusions, seeing things that weren't really there. He stepped into an open field and he saw a building in the distance that looked like a farmhouse. So he decided to press on towards the building while using the forest as cover. Once he got close to the building, he realized it wasn't a farmhouse, but a school building. Exhausted, hurting, bleeding, and scared, he sat on the front steps. Still paranoid that the 4 men were looking for him, he felt exposed, and he knew he needed to find help soon. So he kept moving with the road, well to his left. He knocked on several more doors of homes, only to be denied help again. Finally, at midnight, somebody took him in. They contacted a doctor, and they called the authorities. Somehow, Crumley had survived this hellish nightmare. At daybreak, the authorities began looking for Lewis's body, and after an exhausting several-hour search, they finally located the gravel pit and the body. The crime scene was horrific. Lewis was lying on his back with his hands tied behind him, a gag in his mouth, 3 or 4 wounds to the back of his head, his pockets turned out, his jugular vein cut, and a small knife stabbed in the middle of his torso. The undertaker was immediately called to remove the body, and the official cause of death was listed as murdered, throat cut, skull crushed. Meanwhile, the 4 men had no idea that anyone survived their attack. They left the gravel pit area and immediately set out for Morgan County, where their true intentions for stealing the car would soon be revealed. That's right, they were going to rob the Oakdale Bank. Once they got to the bank, it was about 3:30 in the morning. 2 of the men, Stevens and McClure, they were carrying a leather bag, and they got out of the car and they worked their way to the back of the bank building, where they broke out a window. Once they were inside the bank, they hid, ready to ambush the cashier when he opened up for morning business. Meanwhile, the other 2 men, Christmas and Petrie, waited in the getaway car just up the hill out of sight. Now these old boys didn't know it, but their plan was about to take a turn for the worse. You see, at 8 a.m., the first employee arrived and unlocked the front door of the bank to begin the day. Little did Stevens and McClure know, but there was also several townsmen that were waiting outside of the bank for it to open. The previous day was payday at several businesses, and the men wanted to cash their checks. The bank teller entered the bank, and he walked toward the cashier cage when the 2 bandits wearing masks and fake mustaches jumped up from behind the counter. However, the bank teller immediately recognized Stevens, fake mustache and all. He had known Stevens, who grew up in Oakdale for several years. McClure held a pistol on the bank teller while Stevens walked around the counter to a group of men standing at the front door to cover him. Everybody in the bank was commanded to get their hands up. 3 or 4 men that were closest to the front door decided to make a break for it. They managed to open the door and run into the streets, which sounded the alarm. Stevens quickly made his way back to the front door to lock it behind the fleeing group. Knowing that the bank scheme was foiled, he ran to the back of the bank and yelled to McClure, "Let's get out of here." McClure grabbed the empty loot bag, and both of them climbed out the back window. The entire plan had went to hell in a handbasket. Fleeing the bank, the 2 robbers headed up the hill towards the getaway car. Petrie and Christmas started up the car, and with all 4 inside, they drove down the hill at a high rate of speed, passing right in front of the bank. Losing no time, the bank teller and several other men jumped in their cars in hot pursuit, and just like that, the chase was on. The roads were rocky and hard to drive, but the smaller cars were no match for the fast getaway car. Ironically, it was no match for the driver either. You see, whoever was driving the Chandler lost control of the car around a curve and wrecked it, hanging the back end of the car over the side of the Emery River Bridge. The 4 men abandoned the car and they ran down the railroad tracks alongside the river. Yet, the search continued all day. Word quickly spread about the stolen Chandler and a murdered man on Black Oak Ridge. Local residents and police began to mobilize a posse. The bank teller and his men found the wrecked car and decided to board a freight rail and travel in the direction that the men were last seen heading. By 2 p.m., they spotted the 4 men sitting on the tracks near a narrow holler surrounded by bluffs. With a surprise attack, they quickly captured Petrie and McClure, and a gun battle erupted. as Christmas and Stevens managed to escape over the top of the ridge. Petrie and McClure were brought to the Harriman jail. However, anger and hostilities were swelling among the residents of the small town. The police chief knew that if he kept the two prisoners there, that a lynch mob would storm the jail and take the prisoners. Expecting trouble, the decision was made to transport the prisoners to Knoxville, since it was a much more secure location with a larger police force. The frantic search continued for Christmas and Stevens. The Tennessee governor placed a $900 wanted dead or alive bounty on their heads. Newspapers reported the story all across America as posse numbers began to swell to capture the two men. News of the reward brought bounty hunters, mountain men, and farmers alike to the mountains of Morgan County. It was estimated that as many as 500 men were combing the countryside looking for the two men. They were equipped with every weapon in the county, and the sounds of bloodhounds echoed through the mountains. Christmas and Stevens knew these hills like the back of their hand. For the next 3 days, they eluded capture in the rough mountain terrain until they came across an empty house in the woods. There, they spent the night and they recharged by eating the only food that was in the house, 1 can of salmon. Eventually, they made their way to a remote area called Nemo and the home of a friend of Christmas who took them in. There, they were able to hide in a cave that was located about 2 miles west of the friend's home. They would come down twice a day for their meals, and from the security of the mountains, they witnessed the posse coming to their friend's house a few times, looking for the fugitives. After 2 weeks of hiding in the cave, they devised a plan for Christmas's brother to sneak the two out of the mountainous area in the trunk of his car. However, once they reached the bottom of the steep, winding roads, the sheriff and his posse were waiting for them with their guns drawn, and they took Christmas and Stevens into custody. Soon, Christmas and Stevens were reunited with Petrie and McClure in Knoxville jail. They were charged with murder and armed robbery, and the prosecution of the state of Tennessee wanted the death penalty. The story captivated all of America. A car theft, a gruesome murder, a heroic escape, attempted bank robbery, a car chase, posses, spectacular captures. It's no wonder newspapers were selling out. The murder was considered one of the most horrendous acts in the history of East Tennessee. Soon, crowds from all over poured into the jailhouse to get a glimpse of the desperados. More than 1,000 people were estimated to have visited the jail to view the 4 men. That was a prelude to what was to become at the actual trial. As the trial approached, reports were starting to make their way to the press that every rental car in East Tennessee had been rented. Every train ticket had been sold, and every hotel was filled, as this was shaping up to be one of the most sensational trials in Tennessee history. On July 18, 1922, the population of Clinton, Tennessee was double its normal size. Trains were arriving full of passengers. Taxis were lined up at the depot, ready to ferry the crowd to the courthouse less than a mile away. Street vendors poured into the city, setting up food stands on each corner surrounding the courthouse. Street performers were also en route. A blind boy stood in the street in front of the courthouse singing for coins. Cigar and cigarette girls were parading up and down the courthouse hallways. The courtroom was jam-packed. Roughly 500 people were squeezed into a room meant for 300. Others not as lucky. They crammed in the hallways and the courthouse steps. Chairs were at a premium. A local furniture store sold out of all its chair inventory on the first day. Spectators were seen leaving the courthouse every day with their chairs. Folks began fighting over them. Squatters' rights seemed to prevail, regardless of the true owner of the chair. However, the July heat was oppressive, and the packed courtroom was like an oven. Shouting above the crowd noise, the judge demanded that an alleyway be formed from the window to the witness box. Spectators, unwilling to relinquish their spots, refused to move. The judge ordered that anybody not obeying his command would suffer a $5 fine. Still, nobody moved. Furious, the judge left his bench and he climbed over the tops of tables and chairs to exact his orders. The bailiff finally created an alley. However, it didn't matter. The heat was still sweltering. At one point, a woman fainted while others became ill. Once the trial began, all 4 defendants refused to take the witness stand, so the court and the jury never heard any claim of innocence from the defendants. They maintained their silence. As a result, it became the first death penalty case in Tennessee history where the defendants had not taken the witness stand in their own defense. However, When Crumley took to the stand on July 21st, the crowd became abnormally silent, hanging on his every word. As Crumley described in detail the horror of the night the defendants murdered his friend and left him for dead. If there was any doubt about the four men's guilt, it ended with Crumley's testimony. The court recessed for the day while the jury deliberated. The carnival atmosphere had reached a pinnacle. Wednesday morning was Judgment Day. The courthouse was at its fullest, with crowds pouring out from the hallways to the steps and into the streets. The jury was ushered into a standing room only crowd. The judge immediately got down to business and he asked the jury if they had reached a verdict. The presiding juror rose. It was apparent to the crowd that the jurors were under extreme stress. The foreman read his statement, and his body began to shake, and tears began to flow. He paused to regain his composure, and he continued. Guilty in the first degree, and the sentence recommendation was death. After calm had been restored, the judge sentenced the men to death by the electric chair. The men were immediately transported to the Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville. Over the next couple months, the four convicted killers exhausted all of their appeals, and finally on March 1st, 1922, the moment had come. The execution was slated for dawn. However, the day began drearily with clouds and rain. McClure's attorney arrived to finish up his will, and he witnessed the scene. The four men were all in cells next to each other, and they were located less than 10 feet from the electric chair. And they were all about to find out firsthand why the chair had the nickname Old Smoky. The most nervous of the men was Petrie, and he appeared that he might collapse as the moment got closer. So, as a reward, the guard strapped him into Old Smoky first, as the other three men, still in their cells, watched in horror. At 6:15 a.m., 2 wet sponges were placed on his body, one on the top of his head that was attached to a metal electrode, and the other sponge was wrapped around his ankle, attached to the other electrode, to make sure that the current flowed through his entire body, from head to toe. The command to flip the switch was given.
Roll on 3.
Black smoke poured from the victim's body and Old Smoky, and it billowed down the hallway into the prisoner's cells. It filled the room with the stench of burning flesh, and within 5 minutes, Petrie was pronounced dead. But there was no time to waste. At 6:30, Christmas was strapped into Old Smoky, and the smoke continued to fill the room. At 6:40, it was Stephen's turn. The plumes of smoke continued. Heck, the guards were getting good at this and improved their electrocution prep time each time a new man was strapped in. Finally, at 6:47 a.m., McClure became the last man strapped into Old Smoky. When it was over, 4 men had died in the electric chair within 32 minutes. This was the first time in Tennessee history, and most likely the last, that 4 men were electrocuted on the same day. Witnesses reported that you could barely see in the room that was full of the stench of death and black smoke, something none of them ever wanted to witness again. It's been over 100 years since these events took place, and this story has nearly been lost to time until now. There's nothing left but a few newspapers and court records. Oh, and Old Smoky. Over the course of its life, 125 men took a ride on Old Smoky before it was decommissioned. But you can still go see Old Smoky the next time you're in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Visit the Alcatraz East Crime Museum, where Old Smoky is on permanent display.
Appalachia's Deadliest rolls on, coming in at number 9. Look out, fellas. She's a bad bitch. Appalachia's Deadliest Wife.
The tragic events that occurred in the North Carolina mountains on the night of December 22nd, 1831, remains one of the greatest mysteries in Appalachia. Almost 200 years later, we still don't know exactly what events led to the murder of a 19-year-old husband, except that his 18-year-old wife was charged with the crime and became the first woman executed in the state of North Carolina and left behind an infant daughter who would never know either of her parents. That's right. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Frankie Silver. Mr. Tom, come quick. Please answer the door. Frankie, what in the world is going on? It's not even daylight for another hour, and it's freezing out here. What's the trouble, Cal? It's Charlie. He never came home last night. He left 2 days ago to get supplies for Mr. Murphy's store down past Troublesome Creek and to check his bear traps while he was out. But I'm getting awful worried. He was supposed to be home yesterday. Anyhow, I just woke up from a terrible dream where I had a vision that Charlie came to me, and he told me he needed help. I'm afraid he got caught in the snowstorm that blew through. Over the next 3 days, all of the men of Burke County engaged in a massive manhunt, combing the steep peaks and the ravines of the North Carolina mountains, searching for 19-year-old Charlie Silver. Day and night, with the aid of tracking hounds, through the bitter cold they searched. But there were no tracks or signs of Charlie anywhere. It was clear Charlie must have succumbed to the elements, and he was probably buried under the 2 feet of fresh snow from the blizzard. They more than likely wouldn't find his remains until spring. The men finally set out to the young wife's cabin to break the news. Charlie's wife, Frankie, was just 18 years old. She was a beautiful girl, and in many ways, she was still adjusting to her role as a homemaker, since her and Charlie had only been married for about a year, but they already had a newborn infant. And here we were, just 3 days before Christmas, and her husband was presumed froze to death. The men filed into the cabin, and after sharing the morbid news, they decided to spend the night until morning before setting out on the trip back home. Most of the men slept on the floor that night, huddled around a small fire that Frankie had built and burned all night long. By the time the morning arrived, the men were enjoying a last hot meal before they set out, when something caught Mr. Tom's eye. There in the fireplace, mixed among the coals and the ashes of the fire that burned the night before, appeared to be bone fragments from an animal, possibly the remains of a squirrel or a rabbit, he thought. However, as he looked closer, it was clear there were many fragments, and they were from a human hand. Tom dropped his plate on the floor and he quickly rose to his feet. "Look here, fellas. There's some bones and greasy ashes in the fireplace." Taking his boot and kicking at it revealed even more remains of human fingers. The men began questioning the young wife, when suddenly another man yelled out, "Look here, boys. There's red stains on the floor, and I can see a pool of blood as big as a hog's liver underneath through the cracks of the floor." As the sun rose, the men tore through the farm looking for Charlie, only to find his head and a torso scattered throughout the property and inside of a small shed. It was in that moment that a bloody axe was found hidden underneath the cabin porch, and Frankie Silver was arrested for the murder of her husband, Charlie Silver. Charlie had been the only son of Jacob and Elizabeth Silver. Charlie's mother died while giving birth to him, and his father Jacob would remarry. Therefore, Charlie had many half-brothers and sisters, and it was Charlie's half-brother Alfred who gave the most quoted description of him. Oh, he was strong and healthy, good-looking and agreeable. He had lots of friends. Everybody liked him. He was a favorite at all the parties, and he could make friends with anybody just by talking and laughing and even playing musical instruments. I think he was the best fiddler I'd ever heard. Indeed, Charlie had taken after his father, and he was very strong, 6 feet tall, dark hair, black eyes, and a fair complexion. Frankie Stewart had come into the Burke County, North Carolina mountains at the age of 6 years old. Coincidentally, her parents settled on one side of Black Mountain. The other side of that same ridge was settled by Jacob Silver and his family 20 years earlier. Folks described Frankie as a mighty little woman. She had fair skin, bright eyes, and she was counted as being very pretty. She had charms, and many folks never saw a smarter little woman, and she was a hard worker too. Heck, she could spin 3 yards of cotton in a day on the big wheel. So it would seem at first glance that Charlie and Frankie were meant for each other, the perfect couple, when they settled down into their own little cabin in 1830. But there was a dark side to the mountain lifestyle during these days. Many old-timers say on the night of December 22nd, 1831, Charlie had been sent to get the Christmas liquor, but on the way home, he did what any 19-year-old would do. He took a few nips. It got to tasting mighty good, so he took another nip. That was even better. And by the time he made it back to the cabin, he arrived home to a complaining wife and a screaming baby. Suddenly, Charlie was in a foul mood. The combination of an irritable young wife, a screaming baby, and a belly full of liquor was a volatile combination. Things soon turned ugly. Charlie picked up his shotgun and without thinking he shouted, "So help me, Frankie, if you don't shut up, I'm going to shoot both of you." Now, he probably didn't mean it, but Frankie wasn't about to stand around and find out. In the blink of an eye, she picked up an axe. "No," she screamed. "I won't let you hurt me or my baby." And she swung the axe. Was it alcohol-fueled rage, a lover's quarrel, or cabin fever? One thing was for sure. Charlie was dead. And there she was, 18 years old, with an infant screaming in the crib, and her husband lying in a pool of blood. Many theories abound about what happened next. Did she have help? Her family lived just on the other side of the mountain, and it would have been easy for them to help her conceal her crime. Did she do it alone? Either way, it was probably Frankie's behavior after the killing, as much as the killing itself, that sent her to the gallows. Clearly, she was frightened. She was a woman in a male-dominated society, and she had just killed her husband, and justifiable homicide never entered into her thinking. There was only one thing to do. She had to make it appear as if Charlie never came home. Now, there will always be conjecture as to whether Frankie had help in her decision, or whether she had any help in the ensuing activity from her mother or her brother. Yet, if they did help her, Frankie agreed to take that secret to her grave. One thing that is certain is the dismemberment and the burning of Charlie Silver was begun that very night. Oh, it was a hasty decision, and one that was doomed to failure. You see, Frankie had never taken into consideration just how long it would take to burn a human body. Within a few days, Frankie, her mother, and her brother were all arrested in connection with a brutal crime. And back in those days, many outsiders thought of mountain people as being ignorant, but they weren't stupid, and they were also fiercely loyal to their families. Figuratively speaking, if one got cut, they all bled. And with that being said, Frankie's family stood beside her in her defense, and Frankie, she remained silent as to if anyone else was involved. And due to a lack of evidence, her mother and her brother were released, but Frankie, she would stand trial for the murder of her husband. Under the laws back during that time, defendants weren't allowed to take the stand in their own self-defense, and many folks argued that Frankie should just plead self-defense. However, in a risky gamble, her attorney and her father decided that she should plead not guilty and make the state prove her guilt. On March 29, 1832, Frankie stood trial for the murder of her husband, unable to speak in her own defense, as her fate rested entirely in the hands of an all-male jury. Despite the horrific details of the murder, the jury was deadlocked 9-3 for Frankie's acquittal, and they asked the judge to rehear several witnesses. But in a baffling turn of events, the jurors were allowed to mingle and discuss the case with observers in the court audience while they waited to rehear testimony. This influence and pressure caused all 12 jurors to suddenly change their minds, and they found Frankie guilty by a unanimous vote, and they sentenced her to death. Although many of the community suspected that Frankie was the victim of abuse, and she wasn't without her supporters, 34 women from the community signed a petition to set her free. But the governor refused to grant a pardon, and that was after 7 members of the jury signed a petition saying that they didn't even believe she should be hanged. But the governor made no response. Soon thereafter, Frankie's father bribed a jailer, and he broke Frankie out of jail. And as a disguise, she dressed up in men's clothes. She even wore an old felt hat. And several days later, the sheriff spotted Frankie's father's old hay wagon, and he instantly recognized the woman's face. "Where you going, Frankie?" the sheriff said. Frankie replied in low a voice as she could muster, "Well, thank you, sir, but my name is Tom." Yet foolishly, Frankie's uncle, who was also in the wagon, said, "Yes, sir, her name is Tom." And just like that, she was taken back to death row. Finally, Judgment Day came. People came from miles around to witness the hanging. Frankie's last request was a piece of cake, which she ate while the noose was being placed around her neck. Moments before she was hanged, the judge asked her if she had anything to say. Frankie looked over at her family, and she suddenly spoke up. Yes, I do." But as soon as she started to speak, her father hollered, "Let it die in you, Frankie. Let it die in you." So she closed her mouth, and she never said another word. Instead, the black mask was pulled down over her face, and she was hanged July 12th, 1833. Did Frankie really kill her husband? Or was it her family who sought revenge for Charlie's abuse of Frankie? Why did her family stop her from saying her last words? One thing is for sure. After Frankie's execution, her family became cursed. Her father was killed by the falling limb of a tree, and her mother died from the bite of a copperhead snake. And soon thereafter, her brother moved to Kentucky, where he was tried and convicted as a horse thief and hung. Many folks are convinced, even to this day, it was Frankie who reached from beyond the grave to punish the real killers.
Coming in at number 8, Billy Dean Anderson, the man who put down his Bible and traded it for a gun. Appalachia's Deadliest Preacher.
You ask me why I'm happy? I'll tell you why. Sin is dead. By his blood, he canceled the writing of ordinance against me, nailing it to his cross. Hallelujah.
My name is Billy Dean Anderson. I was born in Pall Mall, Tennessee, just south of the Kentucky border. My grandparents raised me from a young age because my ma and pa, well, I'm not going to go there. I came into this world in the era of the Great Depression, but truth be told, we never noticed when it started or ended here in the mountains. Growing up as a boy, life was a never-ending cycle of working on the farm and going to church every time the doors would open. I mean, I went to school like other kids, but none of that stuff ever interested me at all. My favorite part of school was when our teacher, Miss Sarah, had traveled from Jamestown to teach us, and she gave each kid a writing pad and a pencil. She spent most of her time talking about reading and arithmetic, but I was usually lost in a daydream, drawing in that notebook. I filled every corner of every page with drawings. I drew outlaws like Frank and Jesse James, and some of my favorite Bible stories, like Daniel and the lion's den, and Jesus as he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. These folks were my heroes, and I would get lost for hours at a time, dreaming of what life must have been like for them, out yonder, beyond those mountains. By the time I was in 8th grade, I felt like there was no use in that old schoolhouse, so I quit. Nothing they tried to teach me made a lick of difference in my life. Like most boys, I was pretty sure I'd end up spending my life toiling away in a logging camp, or even worse, hidden away in the darkness of a coal mine from sunup to sundown. So it was. I spent my youth learning as much as I could about living right, living for the Lord. I could recite pretty much any Bible verse, and soon I got to where I'd heard our preacher preach so much that I could have pretty much delivered the sermon myself. In fact, by that time, I used to occasionally sit in for the preacher as sort of an apprentice. I lived for these moments, and they caused me to study the Bible more and to constantly seek a closer relationship with the Lord. It should come as no surprise that by the time I was 18, I submerged myself full-time in the ministry. That little church in the Wolf River Valley, it was my refuge, and I preached God's word with all my might. Before long, I got a reputation as a brimstone and fire preacher, and I like that. I like to see folks get excited in church, and most of all, I love to see a soul get saved and be welcomed into the kingdom of God. One of the hardest things for a man to do in these mountains was to stay away from corn liquor. As a child, my grandparents had shielded me from the effects of this poison. Yet, as a man, I soon found out that he was all around. Heck, even the finest preachers would have a little nip before or after a sermon. I once heard a preacher proclaim that in heaven there would be plenty of possum taters and brandy, because heaven, it just wouldn't be right without them. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I began sneaking a little taste of apple brandy before each sermon as a way of tuning up for the sermon. And after a while, I would have another sip or two after the congregation had left. I began spending a lot of time with new friends. And one of the ways we would pass time, we would take our pistols down to the river and target practice. It all seemed harmless enough until one night in 1959, we all loaded up in my buddy's Chevy and we went to the drive-in movie theater in Jamestown. As the night went on, we had finished 2/5 of whiskey, and my buddy James said, "Hey man, let's go get some popcorn." But the problem was, none of us had any money. "Oh, don't worry about that. We'll just talk tough and scare them a little bit, and they'll give us what we want." So we walked to the concession stand, and James began asking for a free bucket of popcorn. But the usher, he wasn't having any of it. "Hey buddy, you're drunk. Take a hike and get lost." And in that moment, I have no idea what came over me. But without thinking, I reached into my coat and I pulled out my .38 pistol. "Give us the popcorn and all the money in the cash register," I demanded. "Billy Dean, what are you doing?" James asked. But I kept that gun pointed right at that usher's face as he emptied $17 out of the register. "Here, take it. It's all I got." Now, I need to pause here for just a moment, because there comes a critical time in a man's life where the course of his entire destiny can change in an instant, depending on what decision he makes. And I didn't know it at the time, but that moment had come for me as I stood there with that gun pointed at that kid who was trembling so much the money was falling from his hands to the ground. But I'd never felt this type of power before. Something took over me, and I cocked the hammer. No, please don't," the kid begged. But I never blinked, and I pulled the trigger, shooting on purpose just 2 inches away from his head and missing on purpose. All my friends were running back to the car. "Let's go, Billy Dean. Let's get out of here." But for just a second, time stood still. I had so much clarity in my mind. I like this. I like this power. And it was in that moment that I traded my Bible for a life of crime. We loaded into the car, and we got out of there as fast as we could. The cops would surely be looking for us, and we needed a place to lay low. So we parked the car behind the church, and we spent the night hiding out in the sanctuary of the church that I preached in. Within a few hours, headlights were shining through the stained glass windows from all directions. Several police cars had the church surrounded, and they demanded that we surrender. Truth is, everyone wanted to walk out of that church right away because they knew what we did. But not me. It took all night until 10 a.m. the next morning before I finally agreed to turn myself in. And just like that, I was arrested as a first-time offender and sentenced to 4 months in jail. That's right. That night changed Billy Dean Anderson for the rest of his life. And scholars and historians have spent the last 50 years analyzing and debating just what went wrong for a mountain man that everyone seemed to like and said he was one of the finest friends you could have. He'd give you the shirt off his back. Everyone liked him, and he liked everyone, just as long as you didn't cross him or happen to be wearing a law enforcement uniform. After Billy Dean was released from jail, he spent the next year in and out of trouble in Fentress County, Tennessee. In 1960, he was arrested for beating an elderly man and robbing him of $85. While he was on trial, he stunned everyone in the courthouse when he suddenly made a mad dash towards the courtroom window, and he jumped from the second story to freedom. He led the sheriff deputies and the bloodhound dogs on a wild chase through the mountains that folks still talk about till this day. Now, after a few run-ins with the law, Billy felt like he could no longer get a fair shake with the local law enforcement. So, on the advice of his lawyer, he packed up his life and moved to Muncie, Indiana. At least he wouldn't have to worry about coal mining or logging. Heck, maybe he'd be able to land one of those factory jobs that so many folks before him had left the mountains for. Looking for a fresh start, Billy Dean Anderson arrived in Indiana in 1961. Yet there was one thing that he didn't realize would be waiting for him when he got there, and that was whiskey. That's right, and he continued drinking. Within months of arriving in Indiana, he was arrested for rape accusations of a 16-year-old girl and carrying a concealed weapon. Authorities in Indiana were unaware of his arrest record in Tennessee, so they allowed him to accept a plea bargain, and they lowered the charges to contributing to the delinquency of a minor. While in jail, Billy Dean managed to escape through an 18-inch hole in a vent shaft, and he evaded authorities for 6 hours before being caught again. For his actions, he was given 6 months prison time in the Indiana State Farm. But he was released early on good behavior. However, within a few weeks, he was back in Muncie, where he was arrested again for disorderly conduct, malicious trespassing, and carrying a concealed weapon. So it was back in jail again for a few weeks, and then out again. One night, he was on a drunk, and he caused a brawl in a pawn shop, where the owner beat Billy Dean so bad with a baseball bat that he had to be hospitalized. He tried his hand as a mechanic, a tree surgeon, and a farmhand. However, just like back in Tennessee, he began running with a rough crowd. And the reality was that this up-and-coming outlaw would soon reveal that he was far rougher than anyone could have ever imagined. It seemed Billy grew tired of being involved in petty crimes. What he needed was to make a big score and to get some money in his pocket. On Friday, January 26th, he found his opportunity. He and a buddy were out drinking at the Cozy Lodge Tavern when suddenly Billy jumped across the bar and put a pistol to the bartender's head, demanding that he open the cash register. Chaos broke out in the crowd as Billy's sidekick blocked the door and held a gun on the crowd. A waitress attempted to run to the back when Billy opened fire on her. The two bandits took $2,600 cash, and as they were leaving the parking lot, they were engaged in a gun battle as they sped off into the night. By the next day, Billy was in jail again, but not for long. You see, he was getting a reputation as an escape artist. He often boasted that there wasn't any jail in the country that could hold him. Well, he lived up to that promise. Within a few days, Billy escaped through a small air conditioning duct to the roof of the jail, where he made his escape in broad daylight. Not one to stick around and wait for the law to catch him, the outlaw made his way back to Fentress County, Tennessee. On his first night back, he got into an argument with an old friend during a poker game, and he shot his friend. When the sheriff arrived on the scene, he tried to arrest Billy, but the man who was shot refused to press charges. Ironically, the next morning, the county sheriff received a call from Muncie, Indiana, and there was a warrant for the fallen preacher's arrest on armed robbery and escape. Armed with that information, the sheriff went back to the scene of the shooting, where Billy had spent the night, and he tried to arrest him. Yet, as the sheriff attempted to put the handcuffs on him, Billy began swinging, and after a brief brawl, he was arrested and extradited back to Indiana, where he was sentenced to prison back at the Indiana State Farm. Now, do you think Billy Dean Anderson was just going to be a model inmate and serve his time for the next 5 years? No, not a chance. Within a month, he'd escaped from prison, and the newspapers began referring to him as Slippery Billy. With all the notoriety, he began using aliases such as James Forrester and William David Upchurch as he bounced from job to job, usually staying no longer than a paycheck at a time. He found himself working as a farmhand outside of Bowling Green, Kentucky. The plantation was located near Park City State Bank, and within a few days, Billy Dean showed up in the lobby, but not to make a deposit. He walked right up to the bank teller and pulled a gun and demanded that they empty the drawer. But he wasn't satisfied with the amount, so he marched all 14 bank customers and 5 bank employees into the vault, where he made the employees continue filling the money bag. He locked everybody in the vault, and he made his escape with a cool $13,212. He knew he couldn't stick around, and by nightfall, he was back in East Tennessee. But he was nervous and spooked that the cops were on his trail. He picked up an old friend, and the two were driving erratically down a dirt road, when suddenly he saw blue lights in the rearview mirror. Now, these Tennessee cops didn't know anything about the robbery in Kentucky, but Billy Dean's heart, it was racing. In his mind, this is surely what this traffic stop was all about. As the highway patrolman approached the criminal's car, Billy opened the door, and he rolled into the road with guns blazing. He quickly got off 4 rounds, hitting the highway patrolman in the shoulder, one bullet lodging in the police car, and another bullet narrowly missing a second officer. The 4th bullet went wild and shot Billy's passenger in the spine. The highway patrolman quickly returned fire with 4 rounds of his own. 1 bullet went through the outlaw's ear, 1 grazed his head, and 2 hit him in the stomach. Billy was severely wounded, and he would need braces for the rest of his life in order to walk. After his stint in the hospital recovering, with 24-hour-a-day police guards to make sure he couldn't escape, he was sentenced to 10 years in Tennessee and forever banished from the state of Indiana. Yet, in prison, deprived of alcohol and guns, Billy turned into the model prisoner, rededicating his life to the Lord and producing many beautiful paintings. His good behavior earned him an early release in 1966. Ironically, when he was released, he was banished from his second state, this time Tennessee. So began a vicious cycle for Billy Dean Anderson, constantly moving back and forth from East Tennessee to Indiana, always leaving a wake of violence wherever he went. In late 1966, Billy was possibly drunk again when he ran an oncoming truck that happened to be driven by the Fentress County Sheriff off the road. The sheriff quickly turned around and chased the perpetrator down. Billy calmly stopped and opened fire, shooting the off-duty sheriff's truck door. The sheriff ran and took cover in the ditch, but Billy kept firing. The bullets were kicking up dust in the sheriff's face, and Billy took another shot at the truck passenger. After a few moments, the bullets stopped, and the sheriff thought that Billy was out of bullets, so he attempted to arrest him. Billy stuck his pistol in the sheriff's gut and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire. Upon examination, the gun did in fact have 1 more bullet in it. Back to jail Billy went for another 2 years. By 1970, he was out again and back in Muncie, Indiana, working as a gas station cashier. When a man pumped $5 gas and refused to pay for it, Billy pulled out his gun and pointed it at the man. A weapons charge on a convicted felon was enough to send him back to the Indiana State Farm. But he was back on the streets again in 1973. His next encounter with the law occurred late one night as Billy and some thugs attempted to break into the liquor store when a silent alarm called the police. When they arrived on the scene, they found Billy Dean Anderson standing in the front of the store with a stolen military rifle. He quickly pointed the rifle at the cop, who was pointing his own shotgun back at him. And after a 10-second stare down, Billy lowered the gun and surrendered. Yet, when the cops examined the stolen gun, they found that Billy had indeed pulled the trigger, as the firing pin had hit the primer on the bullet. But it didn't fire. So after posting a $1,500 bond, he was a free man again. Billy's life was spiraling out of control, and he was clearly running out of time. But he couldn't stop. In October of 1973, he and two other men committed armed robbery of the Farmers Bank of Moreland in Indiana, and it got away with $12,000. During the getaway, they drove right through a police roadblock and escaped. They would have to lie low until the money ran out, and soon it did, and Billy once again resurfaced in Tennessee. On December 30th, 1973, an East Tennessee sheriff responded to a burglary call at a local honky-tonk. In his own words, this is what transpired when he arrived on the scene. There were two cars there, parked in front of the club, a red and white 1955 Ford and a white Pontiac. I went to the door, around behind the building, and someone had been picking at the door, and the wall beside the door with a sledgehammer and a steel bar. I peeped around the corner of the building. I just stuck my head around, and there he stood with his gun on his shoulder. I jerked my head back, and I ran to my car and tried to leave, to try to call for help. I took out running around the building. Suddenly, I heard a gunshot, and it blew a hole in the rear door of my car. The next shot busted through the rear door window, through the cage, and through the seat under the headrest, and it cut the zipper in two on my jacket. I had been hit in the arm. I was hurt bad, and as I sped off, I could still hear gunshots. He had blown the bone out of my upper arm, even the artery. I was spurting blood all the way. I made it to a gas station where I passed out, but the owner drove me to the hospital. Back to jail Billy went, this time in Morgan County, Tennessee, where Slippery Billy struck again. He managed to cut through a half-inch steel plate wall and a heavy-duty lock, and he walked out of jail a free man again. But this time, he had went too far, and he was now considered a cop killer, and he was placed on the 10 most wanted list in America by the FBI. The FBI launched into an all-out manhunt, combing the mountains of East Tennessee, all of Kentucky and Indiana. They searched as far as Los Angeles and Mexico. Every FBI office in the country wanted Billy Dean Anderson, dead or alive. Soon, East Tennessee was swarmed with helicopters, bloodhounds, secret agents, and strangers wearing earpieces, asking all sorts of questions of everyone in the area. But what they weren't prepared for was that none of these mountain folk would tell them anything. I mean nothing. None of them would help them. Like Billy Dean, nobody in these mountains trusted the law. Most folks didn't even believe Billy had done half of what he was accused of. And while the FBI considered Billy a notorious outlaw, folks around here considered him an absolute legend. And they helped Billy Dean any way they could. Friends helped him. Strangers helped him. Moonshiners helped him. Everybody loved him. All told, Billy Dean evaded the FBI by living in a cave in the remote mountains that he knew like the back of his hand for nearly 5 years. His legend grew stronger and stronger. The FBI had given him the internal code name of Mountain Man. However, even in the strongest knit community, eventually there's a snitch.
And in July of 1979, someone provided an anonymous tip to the FBI of Billy's whereabouts. And armed with this information, agents swarmed the area and surrounded Billy's mother's home, where he frequently would be provided with supplies. And what happened that night on July 8th, 1979, may never truly be known. What is known is that Billy Dean Anderson stepped out of his mama's house and waved goodbye to her, not knowing that the entire area was swarming with FBI agents. The FBI claims that they asked him to stop and surrender, and that Billy Dean raised a .22 rifle at the lawman, forcing the agent to shoot him with 2 rounds of double-aught buckshot. And in that moment, all of Billy Dean Anderson's earthly troubles were taken away. The FBI also claimed that Billy had 2 more pistols on his waist at the time of the shooting. However, locals who were on the scene claimed that Billy was unarmed and that he was shot in the back with a hailstorm of bullets, 19 bullets, right in front of his mother. They claimed the FBI never intended to take him alive. They simply wanted him dead for embarrassing their agency for the past 5 years. And just like that, one of the wildest, unlikeliest of criminal careers came to an end. Ironically, Billy is buried in the graveyard of the same church that he used to preach at before he lost his way, and several of his paintings still adorn the sanctuary.
Coming in at number 7, the true story that rocked Appalachia, John Stanley and Clarence Cox. It had been a long, cold February day on a Snotterly farm. The slow, steady rain had swelled the creek, and its current was running strong, making it the perfect day for the locals to pay a visit to Henry Snotterly's mill to make some flour, and perhaps more importantly, to catch up on all the local gossip. Old man Snotterly himself wasn't one to partake in the ceremonial wagging of tongues due to his reputation as a respectable man of the Lord. After all, had he not donated the land for the local Methodist Episcopal Church, and much of the money to build it for that matter? No, sir. Henry had always remained a bystander during these gossip sessions. After all, in his mind, the reason a man was born with 2 ears and 1 tongue was so he could do twice as much listening as he did talking. Truth be told, Henry Snotterly was the richest man in Union County, Tennessee, and he had operated the mill on Hines Creek for over 70 years. He was still healthy and sharp as a tack at 90 years old. Besides being the community miller, he was also known as a generous man. He had spent several decades of his life donating both time and money to help out those in need. There wasn't a single time anybody in the small town of Maynardville could recall that old man Snotterly had ever turned anyone away. Now, Henry's cabin was located about 100 yards away from the mill, and being the family man that he was, many times he just allowed folks free use of the mill while he stayed at home with his wife Serena, and that way he could spend time with his grandchildren. So, no one thought anything of it when Henry announced that he was heading home for the day, and for his nephew John to oversee the mill. A few moments later, Mr. Snotterly was greeted at the homestead by several family members who had dropped by for supper. And Granny had cooked a fine meal of fried taters, cabbage seasoned with pork, and a cast iron skillet full of hot buttered cornbread. After the meal, the family retired to the main room and took their places, circled around the fireplace. Serena immediately took up her favorite rocking chair and resumed knitting on a piece she'd been working on for the past 3 days. Their daughter Lucinda was also there, and she was a nightly visitor, always helping her mama out around the house. And rounding out the visitors on this night were two of the Snodderly's grandchildren, Sam and Rena. Henry never was the type to miss an opportunity to read some scripture to his grandbabies, and what better time to do so than now, as they were all gathered around the cozy fireplace. Outside, a thick fog had settled in, and the rain continued as the darkness began to fall. But inside the cabin, it couldn't have been any more perfect. As the old wise grandsire reached for the good book and began thumbing through his worn-out pages for the perfect passage, he spoke.
Sam, take a look-see out that door and make sure them fellas have finished up at the meal before I start out. 'Cause once I get to reading, I don't like to break the moving of the spirit with interruptions. Yes, sir,
the 20-year-old grandson replied cheerfully and walked towards the front door. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment. Sometimes, the most ordinary, routine moments of life can be torn apart in the blink of an eye without any warning. And for this family, that moment had arrived and was waiting for him on the other side of that front door, desperate, cold, and wet, with the most evil and wicked intentions ever to reside in a man's soul. Just then, Sam slowly opened the door, careful not to let it swing open too wide and let the cold in.
Yes, sir, Papa. Everything's shut down and all is quiet.
Sam moved to close the door when suddenly someone kicked the door open from the other side, sending Sam crashing to the floor. Before anybody could move, there stood a wild-eyed man, soaking wet with rain and pointing a pistol at old man Snodderly. The grandsire gripped his Bible tightly and raised his hands in the air. "Dear Lord, protect us," was all he managed to say before the assassin opened fire, blowing a hole clean through Henry Snodderly's chest as he collapsed to the floor. Chaos broke out in the small cabin, with women and children screaming, when in stepped another masked man with a huge scar running all the way across his forehead. The stranger quickly pointed a pistol at Sam on the floor. Granny was seated right next to the doorway that led to the dining room, and she made a run for it. No sooner than she had stepped through the dining room, another bullet was fired, hitting her in the back. The knitting needles flew from her hands as she crashed through the kitchen table to the floor, still clinging to life desperately as she tried to crawl. Just then, the gunmen followed her. Seeing their opportunity, both Lucinda and Rena ran for the back door. Just as they rounded the corner, bullets rang out again, barely missing them as they disappeared into the dark and rainy night. The gunman returned his attention to Granny, but she had stopped moving as she laid in a pool of blood. There was no one else in the cabin alive except for poor Sam and the two outlaws. "Open the damn dresser and pour everything on the floor," one of the men yelled.
Okay, I'll do it. Please don't shoot me,"
Sam begged as he dumped the contents on the floor. Not seeing what they had came for, the man yelled out, "Open the rest of them." Sam tried, but the top drawer was locked, and he could only manage to open the bottom drawer halfway because his grandpa's lifeless body was collapsed in front of it. Just then, the man holding the gun on Sam saw some shiny coins among the contents on the floor. He walked towards them and bent over to pick it up. Sam knew that they were going to kill him, so he summoned the courage to run. Straight for the front door he went. The gunman wheeled around and fired 2 more shots into the thick log walls. All hell had broken loose. Sam ran into the foggy night towards his brother's house for help. Meanwhile, Lucinda and Rena had been running frantically into the night. First, they hid underneath the mill, but hearing all the gunshots made them think the killers were searching for them. Lucinda said to Rena, "We gotta get across that creek to the other side." "But I can't swim. The water's too high. I can't do it." "Rena, you gotta do it or they're gonna kill us." "Hold my hand. I'll help you get across." Desperately, they stepped into the near freezing water of the creek. Rena didn't even have shoes on. "Come on, Rena. We gotta go now," Lucinda shouted as she pulled Rena into the swift water, but the bottom was covered with mud and slippery rocks, and the young granddaughter wasn't strong enough to even stand in the strong current. In that moment, Rena fell into the water, with Lucinda clenching her tiny hand with all the strength she had. But the whole time, Rena could barely keep her head afloat and was swallowing so much water that she could barely take a breath. Lucinda pulled with all her might, trying to get Rena back to the shore. But just then,
Lucinda slipped in the mud, and as she fell, she lost hold of Raina's hand. Suddenly, both of them were separated in the dark, frigid water, fighting for their lives. For the next few minutes, Lucinda fought for her life, caught in the current, gasping for air each time her head surfaced, clawing at any branch she could reach. All the while, her body was smashing into boulders in the swollen torrent as the rain poured from the heavens non-stop. In one frantic act of desperation, she reached for a limb that was hanging above, and somehow she held on, and after fighting her way inch by inch, she reached the banks, completely spent and exhausted. Yet her heart was tore out. Young Raina was nowhere to be found. Somehow, Lucinda had survived, but she was suffering from hypothermia as she ran into the dark woods, hoping desperately to find shelter. When she finally saw an opening, she ran into a field, exhausted as she trudged through the mud and the rain. She could barely see because of the fog, and delusion was beginning to set in from the trauma of it all. She came to a deep gully, and then she realized she must be close to her brother John's house. She followed the side of the gully for some time before she slipped and fell down the side, tumbling until she blacked out. By now, Sam had reached his Uncle John's house, and he told him of all the horrors that had unfolded inside the cabin. Without any hesitation, the men grabbed every gun in the house and set out on the horses. They stopped at two neighbors' houses on the way, and several more men joined their armed posse. There was no time to seek out the law at this time of night or in these weather conditions. No, sir. It was time for mountain justice as the men raced towards Henry Snodderly's cabin. Nearly a mile away, with her dress nearly torn off of her, young Raina had somehow managed to survive the creek and had walked to John's house. She was in complete shock. However, everyone in the house was now gone, and the door was locked. She had no choice. She had to get out of the rain. And in her mind, the killers were still after her. So she busted out the window with a rock, and she made her way into the house, where she hid in a closet for the rest of the night. About midnight, the posse had finally reached the cabin, armed to the teeth. Yet, there was no sign of the killers. They had stolen two horses and disappeared into the night. Inside the cabin, it was a horrific scene. The men had went through every drawer looking for money. Yet, in the end, they had committed these brutal murders and hadn't found a single penny of money in the house. The only question that remained was who were these men and where did they go? By daybreak, the sheriff had arrived on the scene. Most of the posse hadn't stuck around to wait on the law, and they had been hot on the trail, following the horse tracks leading away from the crime scene. Lucinda had regained consciousness and finally made it to John's house at daybreak, where she saw the broken window and found young Raina, shaken and unable to speak, still hiding in the closet. The sheriff, being the noble lawman that he was, immediately began his investigation of the crime scene. After interviewing Lucinda and Sam, some details didn't quite add up in this sheriff's mind. Two people were murdered. There was no evidence of a forced entry, and supposedly the men had committed these awful crimes. Yet they didn't steal any money. After all, there was still $116 in that dresser in the drawer that just happened to be locked. And it just so happened that Lucinda was the only one who had a key to it. No, this didn't look right in the sheriff's mind at all. Perhaps the whole thing was simply made up, and with that in his mind, shockingly, he arrested Sam for the murder of Henry and Serena Snodderly. So, while the law was focusing solely on Sam, the real murderers had time to completely disappear before Sam and Lucinda were able to convince them that they recognized who the man was with the unmistakable scar running across his face. And that man was John Stanley, who had been living in the Carnes community. And Stanley was known to run with another man named Clarence Cox, who was from a place called Scarborough, known nowadays as Oak Ridge. And as word spread all over East Tennessee about the murder, newspapers spread the story, and witnesses who knew Stanley and Cox began to come forward and tell a tale of how one night they were drinking and playing poker, and they heard the two men bragging that they knew an old man who kept a bag of silver coins hid in his cabin, that he was so heavy he couldn't be lifted by a single man, and they were going to pay him a little visit. And it was true that the old man was a wealthy man, and now that he was dead, his family wanted the killers caught, so they offered a $200 reward for their arrest, and the state of Tennessee offered another $300. And let me tell you, $500 was a fortune in 1894. Within days, every bounty hunter, detective, and mountain man were combing the hills of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky looking for the two killers. The sounds of hounds and horses echoed all across the mountains. Before long, an anonymous tip tracked the fugitives to where they were spotted in Kentucky, so they fled to Virginia. But because of the scar on John Stanley's face, he couldn't disguise himself or blend in. No matter where he ran, bounty hunters and mountain men alike began to close in on the wanted men, and they knew their time was running out. So in a twist of events, they stole a boat in Virginia and floated back down the Powell River, all the way back to Tennessee, about 5 miles from Clinton. There, they concocted a plan to have Clarence's father turn him into the law so he could collect the reward money to hire lawyers in their defense. Just like that, they turned themselves in. But, you see, the wheels of justice moved much swifter back in those days. And within just 4 months of the original brutal crimes, both men stood trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder. And the prosecution, they wanted an eye for an eye, and that meant the death penalty. The trial captivated the nation as the potential for the first legal hanging in Union County, Tennessee drew near. The courthouse was standing room only during the trial. It quickly became apparent that these killers had made many mistakes during their initial getaway. After killing the Snarleys, the men stopped several times the next day, asking for food and directions. There were nearly a dozen witnesses that placed them in the area of the crime. And seeing how the prosecutor in this case was none other than John Snodderly, son of Henry Snodderly, you could be assured that he left no stone unturned in building a case against the defendants. And by the time the prosecution rested its case, there was nary a doubt in any person's mind that Clarence Cox and John Stanley were both guilty of murder, and the jury agreed too, finding both men guilty on all counts. When the judge asked Stanley and Cox if they had anything to say before he passed their sentence, they maintained that they hadn't had a fair trial and that they wanted to appeal. When they were finally done speaking, Judge Hicks began. "I'd rather that this cup would pass from me, but I tell you, the sheriff will fix an enclosure within 1 mile of the jail in Maynardville, Tennessee, at a place that suits himself, and on the 24th day of August, 1894, he will hang both of you by your necks until you are dead." True to their words, both men did appeal their cases to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which only temporarily delayed the case, because again, justice was swift, and their convictions were upheld. So it was, 10 months after committing one of the most brutal crimes ever documented in East Tennessee, Stanley and Cox awaited their day of reckoning on December 22nd, 1894, in their jail cells. This was to be the first legal hanging in the history of Union County, and nearly 5,000 folks came in from everywhere to witness it. By sunrise, every picket, hitching post, and swinging limb in Maynardville was called into use for hitching horses. Yards and fields were turned into parking lots of horses and mules. By noon, the jailhouse yard surrounding Hangman's Hill had turned into a sardine mass of humanity. Inside the jail, the sheriff's wife had cooked the last meal for the convicted men who had spent the day with preachers. Finally, the time had come, and the sheriff gave the order. The 2 men were hogtied and placed on the back of a mule-drawn wagon, surrounded by armed guards. Imagine for a moment what went through the men's minds as they were placed on the wagon, and they looked down and realized that each of them were sitting on their own coffin. As they looked up and saw the gallows just up on the hill, hundreds of men jostled with one another for a glimpse of the dead man. Many men ran through the creek, which ran beside the road, for a better look. Yet, during this carnival-like atmosphere and spectacle, there was one hitch. You see, Tennessee law stipulated that the hanging couldn't be performed in public, and that only a few witnesses were permitted to be present. So the sheriff had constructed a 15-foot-high fence around the gallows, so that the thousands who had traveled to the little community of Maynardville couldn't see the actual hanging. No sooner than the armed convoy entered the fence and closed the gate to the public, men who had been drinking all day began ripping the wooden planks off the fence, before hundreds of men began storming the fence, finally knocking the entire structure to the ground in a stampede. The sheriff realized he was outnumbered, and he couldn't do anything to stop the entire crowd from getting a front row seat. The 2 killers took their places on the platform, and while Cox stood there shaking, Stanley spoke to the crowd. Men and boys alike, hear my words to you now. Drinking whiskey and carrying a gun is what brought me here. Now, I hope none of you have to go the way I'm about to go. And with that, he took a small plug of tobacco and began to chew it. He held up the rest of the plug and he asked, "Is there any man here that wants the rest of this? I got no more use for it." Just then, an old mountaineer made his way through the crowd running. "I'll take it! I'll take it!" He gladly took the gift, put it in his pocket, and thanked the condemned man. As Stanley enjoyed one last chew, he said, "Sheriff, I've got one more last request. Can we sing in the sweet by and by?" "Of course we can," the sheriff replied. Slowly, several men in the crowd began singing. Then, a sea of 5,000 men sang in sweet harmony as Cox and Stanley took in the scene. Just then, the sheriff gave the order, and both men fell to their deaths at the exact same time. The crowd kept right on singing as their bodies gently swayed in the breeze, thus concluding the first and last legal hanging to ever occur in Union County, Tennessee. Coming in at number 6, the notorious train robber, Rube Burrow. They say I was the last notorious outlaw of the 1800s. Some called me a train robber and a murderer, while others called me a hero and a modern-day Robin Hood. Yet, you won't find any Hollywood movies about me, and chances are, as you watch this right now, you probably never heard of me. But history? She tells a different story. That's right, I was the subject of the largest and most expensive manhunt in American history. I was bolder and more daring than the James Gang, and just as ruthless as Billy the Kid. My friends called me Red Rube, but my enemies, they called me the King of the Outlaws. And this is my story. I was born in 1855 on the border of Alabama and Mississippi, just as tension was mounting across America in the build-up to the war between the states. My ma was what folks nowadays like to call a granny witch, but she would have scoffed at that name, since back then folks called her a granny woman or a faith healer. She believed in using nature as medicine
and she had remedies for everything, from the fever to stomach ailments, warts, rashes, and even heart problems. Folks traveled from all over to see her, bringing the elderly and babies alike due to her reputation as a healer. Paul was a man of many skills. He spent his days farming and his nights making what he called bug juice from corn. He also was the only teacher that us 10 youngins ever knew. He taught us all how to read, write, and to do math. It was Paul who gave me the nickname of Rube when I was just a little boy. And Ma and Paul were what you would call good people. They were folks you could count on, and they had every reason in the world to believe that I would grow up to be a respectable man. Me, I was a typical boy, spending most of my time helping out on the farm, and my spare time hunting or fishing. Truth be told, I was happiest when I was in the woods. I knew how to make fish nets from the bark of a willow tree, and I liked to make snare traps for squirrels or gum traps from hollow logs to catch rabbits. But my hunting adventures changed forever when I was 13, and Paul bought me a Winchester. I loved that gun, and I never went anywhere without it. And I was a crack shot, too. I mastered the art of slow breathing while aiming at the target, releasing all tension in my body, and smoothly squeezing the trigger after exhaling. I spent as much time as I could in nature because our small cabin only got smaller as I grew into my teen years, and I was itching to leave the nest and make my own way in life. So, without any ceremony, on my 18th birthday, I bid Ma and Paul farewell, and I took my trusty rifle, and I moved to Erath County, Texas, to help my uncle out on his farm. I quickly learned how to handle a horse, and I spent 2 years going on cattle drives. I loved the excitement of the wide open space of the Midwest. I felt the freedom and the adrenaline rush. Best of all, I was making good money too. Before long, I met a beautiful woman named Virginia. She had willowy eyes and a radiant smile and long cascading brown hair. A whirlwind romance followed, and I promised her that I would give her the entire world and devote the rest of my life to her. And the happiest day of my life was the day we were married, and I purchased our own small ranch to start our family on. You know, one of the great ironies in life is how everything can seem so perfect right here and right now, in this very moment. Yet, you're busy working for something called tomorrow. And tomorrow, well, it's something that's always just out of reach. It's easy to fall into this routine of life, and I admit I did. I was always living for tomorrow, when it turns out I should have appreciated what I had today. I had my own little piece of heaven, married to an angel, and we had 2 small children. Life was perfect. That is, until one day in 1880, when I was 25 years old. Virginia got powerful sick with yellow fever and quickly fell gravely ill. Now I tell you, there's no worse feeling than watching the person you love more than life itself slowly slip away from this world right before your eyes and being completely helpless. I sat by her side as she grew weaker and weaker, her breaths becoming so faint and infrequent that I couldn't tell if she would be able to take another. And then she didn't. I sat there in the screaming silence of that room with my ears ringing, my eyes flinting about the room, hoping to catch a glimpse of her spirit as it left. But she was gone, and in that instant, I was broken, and I cried for the only time in my life. Everything from that moment on was a dull gray, and my life would never be the same.
Hey guys, JD here. Click the link below to check out my new book. It's full of stories just like the one you're listening to right now. Now, back to the story.
The following spring, after Rube Burrow lost Virginia, he was late getting his crops in the ground, which was further complicated by a long summer drought. Truthfully, he was having a hard time taking care of his 2 small children, let alone the ranch. So he made the difficult decision to take his children to go live with his Ma and Pa back in Alabama. While he was there, his younger brother Jim volunteered to go back to Texas with Rube
and help his older sibling get back on his feet. Yet, by the time Rube and Jim got back, some thief had stolen all the cattle, and his crops were completely withered from the hot Texas sun and the lack of rain. To top it all off, Rube was way behind on his land note, and the bank was threatening to repossess it. Now, Rube had been raised to be an honest man, to believe that if you worked hard enough, you could make it in this world. But he had literally lost everything he'd ever had. And there comes a time that when a good man is pushed too far, he reaches a breaking point. And for Rube, he had reached it. He just needed to get his hands on some money and fast. And one morning, the two brothers were standing at a depot in Bellevue, Texas, watching a passel of businessmen and bankers board a westbound train, when suddenly it came to them. Let's rob this train. We won't hurt no one, and we'll get just enough money to pay that bank note on the farm. Just as the train was full, the two aspiring outlaws boarded, and Jim put a gun to the conductor's head, while Rube yelled out,
"Get your hands up, and don't make a move unless you're tired of living."
They could half believe it, but folks started handing over their money, and their pocket watches too. They had successfully robbed the entire first car without even alarming any of the other passenger cars. And as the two men exited the train, Rube tipped his hat to the conductor, and the brothers disappeared without anyone even giving chase. Man, that was easy money. Indeed, $300 cash and 16 pocket watches. But it wasn't enough money, and within a month, they struck again, this time in Palo Pinto, Texas. They tried the exact same scheme, but many folks started running off the train, so Rube shot 2 warning holes in the roof of the train to settle them down and let them know he meant business. And it worked. The two bandits made off with $2,000, and in 1886, that was a lot of money. Best of all, they had robbed both trains, and no one even knew who they were, and the law had no clue to the bandits' identity. Strapped with all this cash, Rube let the bank foreclose on his old farm, and instead he paid cash for a new piece of land, and the two brothers set about running an honest cattle operation, and they lived happily ever after. Well, for at least 6 months, that is, before they struck again, this time in Benbrook, Texas, robbing the eastbound Pacific Express. Yet, they had devised a new plan to discourage passengers from trying to escape during the robbery. This time, the desperados purchased tickets and they took their seats. Just as they neared a long trestle that crossed over a deep river ravine, they pulled their pistols on the conductor, demanding that he stop on the trestle, which he did. And the heist was on, and no one dared to jump out of the train down to the jagged rocky canyon that was nearly 200 feet below. The plan worked to perfection, and the renegades could barely carry the bag of nearly $30,000 that they had netted from the stick-up. It was the perfect blueprint for a train heist. So 3 months later, they robbed the exact same train on the exact same trestle again, netting another $3,000. By now, the highwaymen had robbed 4 trains and were wanted dead or alive. But lawmen and detective agencies alike were stumped for answers. And despite the boldness of the holdups in broad daylight with hundreds of witnesses, no one knew either one of the brothers' identities. All totaled, they had netted over $1 million in today's money. They could have simply disappeared and never been heard from again. But, as you might have guessed, that ain't what they did. And what happens next would put the lawmen hot on the trail of these wanted men. Up till now, Rube and Jim Burrow had committed the perfect crimes, 4 daring train robberies, and they were completely anonymous, except in the newspapers, where headlines of their sensational crimes were front page from coast to coast, with stories calling them more notorious than the James Gang. But they just couldn't leave well enough alone. And on December 9th, 1887, they robbed their 5th train in Genova, Arkansas, stealing $3,500 from the strong box. The heist went off without a hitch, and the bandits disappeared into the woods with the money. But wagging tongues gave swift wings to the news of the plunder. And within hours, a posse had formed and began searching up and down the railroad, when lo and behold, they found old Rube and Jim walking down the train tracks with a bag of money. And the brothers had another choice to make in this moment. Up until now, they hadn't shot or hurt anyone. They could have just surrendered and at least escaped with their lives. And as the posse approached the brothers with guns drawn, Rube gave Jim a quick wink, and both men suddenly pulled 2 pistols each, and all hell broke loose. Bullets kicked up a storm of dust as the posse dove off the rails and into the brush, all the while blindly returning fire. Amazingly, the brothers escaped without injury, but in the chaos, Jim had thrown down his new coat that he had had specially made for him back in Texas on the ground, and he left it behind. And when the law opened that coat up, it was engraved with the Outlaws' initials and the address of the shop that made it. By the next day, the shop owner revealed to authorities the identity of the 2 men that he had made the jackets for. And just like that, Rube and Jim were the most wanted men in America. With detectives from several railroads, lawmen, and mercenaries alike from all across America hunting for them, and that $2,500 reward, dead or alive, that was placed on their heads. Looking to lay low, the renegades made their way back to Alabama, where, believe it or not, folks thought of them as heroes, taking on the deep pockets of the railroad and the crooked government. For months, every resident in Lamar County, Alabama, helped the fugitives hide, giving them food, shelter, and ammo. The brothers took this opportunity to bury thousands of dollars in gold in a secret area, hoping to return to it one day. And locals were tight-lipped to any lawman. They wouldn't give any details to their heroes' whereabouts. It worked for nearly 3 months when Rube and Jim got the itch to make a move. You would think that the last place they would have showed their faces again was on a train. But that's exactly what happened when they tried sneaking to Montgomery, Alabama. But the conductor immediately recognized the pair, and the law were promptly waiting to arrest both of them once the train stopped. As soon as Rube stepped off the train, the sheriff's voice rang out.
"Red Rube, your running days are over. You're under arrest."
To that, old Rube replied with a smile, "I reckon not." And a fist fight broke out among the lawmen and the 2 brothers. Rube managed to pull his gun, and he shot one man and managed to disappear into the crowd, who was gathered to watch the melee. Jim, however, was arrested and promptly sent back to Arkansas and placed in jail. By morning, a posse had tracked Rube to an abandoned cabin where he was sleeping. The posse flung a Molotov cocktail through one of the windows, setting the cabin into flames. And within seconds, Red Rube came running out of the door with nothing but pants on and a pistol in each hand, and his rifle slung across his bare chest, firing hot lead in every direction. Several members of the arresting party were hit, and Rube was hit in the shoulder before he escaped into the swamps, where he hid until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, he stumbled upon another cabin with smoke coming up from its chimney. But he was desperate, and the door just happened to be unlocked. So the outlaw quietly sat in front of the fire for a few minutes, warming his feet, before stealing some shoes and a quilt. Oh yeah, and a horse. And just like that, he was on the run again. Back in Arkansas, Jim had contracted tuberculosis, and by 1888, he had died in jail. Meanwhile, Rube had managed to live in the Alabama wilderness for a few months before a postman saw him and threatened to turn him in. Not taking any chances with a loose tongue, Rube shot and killed him, and the law was hot on his trail when he disappeared into the woods again, only to resurface in Duck Hill, Mississippi, where he decided to pull off a 6th train robbery, this time without his blood brother. As he boarded the train, he pulled out both pistols, holding one on the conductor and waving the other on the passengers, demanding money. Seeing that Rube was all alone, one passenger decided to play hero and rushed towards him to try to stop the outlaw. As his reward, he took 3 bullets to the stomach. Rube had killed another man, and the nationwide manhunt intensified, with the Alabama National Guard descending on his hometown and jailing many locals to make sure folks couldn't hide him anymore. At this point, the most expensive and extensive manhunt in American history was underway for the outlaw Rube Burrow, but he was nowhere to be found. For the rest of 1888, he had simply walked into the woods and vanished yet again. It had been over a year since the last sighting of Rube, and many folks began speculating that he was dead. But he removed all doubt when he blazingly robbed his 7th train in Buckatuna, Mississippi in September of 1889. After the outlaw made his escape, he stole a wagon with a team of oxen and slowly made his way to where all criminals go to retire, Florida. There, believe it or not, Rube Burrow, the notorious outlaw, literally gave up a life of crime and went back to farming for several months. Yet, the law wasn't impressed with this early retirement plan and continued hunting him till they found him and attempted to arrest him in Milton, Florida. But, as you should know now, Rube simply ran into the swamps of the Blackwater River State Park forest and disappeared again for months. The outlaw had been making a mockery of the law and had been on the run for 4 solid years. But it seemed by now that there was only one way that he would ever be stopped, and that was with a bullet. In September of 1890, unbelievably, Rube Burrow single-handedly pulled off his 8th train robbery in Flotation, Florida for $256, and he got away with it until he was recognized by 4 men in Wilcox County. The outlaw had his trusty pistols and that rifle that he had had since he was a boy laying beside him as he ate supper when the 4 men ambushed him from behind and a brawling fist fight. Rube was outnumbered badly, but he let the fists fly, and he used his teeth to bite any part of his attackers that he could get them on. But the odds were too great, and he was arrested and jailed. His running days were over. He was finally locked up behind bars, and there would be no escape. Or would there? You see, Rube kept complaining of hunger, but there was no food in the jail. So Rube told the jailers,
"I've got some ginger snaps in my bag. Hand it to me, and you can have some too if you want."
"Don't do it, Jimmy. That old boy is smiggy as hell,"
one guard cautioned.
"Oh, it's all right. We got both his pistols and his rifle locked up across the street."
And with that, they handed the prisoner his bag. Rube reached right in, and he pulled out a couple ginger snaps and passed one to each one of the guards.
"See, I told you, Earl."
One guard snarked at the other. But, in that moment, he heard the cocking of a pistol pointed through the bars at him. Rube had pulled a small revolver from a hidden pocket of the bag and promptly locked the jailers in his cell while he set out across the street to retrieve his $168 and the guns that the sheriff had taken from him. Within moments, Rube kicked the door open and demanded his weapons.
Okay, calm down,"
the sheriff said, and he handed him back his 2 pistols.
"Where's my rifle? I've had it since I was a boy, and I ain't leaving until I get it."
All right, no problem. Take it easy there. It's right here. I'll get it for you,"
the lawman nervously said, with his hands held up. But, you see, the lawman had given the gun away to one of the boys that captured Rube, and as he turned around to pretend he was securing the rifle, he quickly spun back around with a revolver he pulled from his pants and opened fire. At nearly point-blank range, the sheriff and the outlaw fought, both firing wildly. Each man had fired 4 of their 6 shots when Rube fired his 5th, blasting through the bone of the lawman's shoulder. And as the official crashed to the ground, he managed to get one last shot off, and it was true, ripping right through Rube Burrow's heart, killing him dead. Over 5,000 people flocked to see Rube Burrow's body at the funeral home. The government was mighty proud of killing him too, and they propped his body up in this iconic photo with his 2 pistols and that rifle that in the end Rube was willing to die for. Ironically, after the public display, Rube's coffin was sealed up and was transported back to his hometown on a, well, you guessed it, on a train. However, as the train approached the depot, where Rube's parents were solemnly standing to receive their son's body. The train never slowed down. Instead, the deputies simply pushed his coffin off the moving train, and when it hit the ground, the wood splintered into 1,000 pieces, slinging Rube's body into the dirt. And if that wasn't horrific enough, it was also clear that the lawman had used Rube's body for target practice. Before sealing the coffin, his poor parents scraped up what was left of their son and buried him in Fellowship Cemetery in Lamar County, Alabama. Oh, and before you go, here's one last detail. You remember that buried money? Well, 4 years after Rube was buried, a local farmer was plowing his field when, lo and behold, he unearthed a chest full of gold coins. The railroad companies quickly sued, trying to claim the gold, but the farmer successfully argued in court that folks find gold buried all the time, and there wasn't any proof that it belonged to the wealthy railroad company. And astonishingly, the farmer got to keep all the money that Rube had died for. What about you, my friend? What do you think about the outlaw Rube Burrow? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more true stories. Coming in at number 5, escape artist Kenny Wagner. My name is Kenny Wagner, and I was born in a one-room cabin near Copper Creek outside of Gate City, Virginia, just after the turn of the century. My family was a typical pioneer family. We still raised all our own crops, tended our farm animals, and hunted for all our meat. In a world of make it do or do without, my pa was a farmer, working sunup to sundown in the fields. He made all his own tools and spent most of his time with his best friend, named Nellie, which just happened to be our own work mule. Ma, on the other hand, she was a kind-hearted woman. She had a smile that would just light up the whole room, and she loved me and my younger sister more than anything in this world. She took care of everybody in the house. She cooked the food and made our clothes, much like all the other mountain women did. But she also saw to it that we learned values and morals. It seemed to me that Ma cared just as much what her children looked like on the inside as we did on the outside. Each evening after supper, my sister and I would take turns holding the kerosene lamp while Pa read a few verses from the Bible. But truth be told, it was Ma that made the words come to life. She was a storyteller and had a way about her where she could just take any passage of Scripture and apply it to our everyday lives. I always looked forward to Ma's stories. You know how sometimes life can be so good and perfect, yet it's human nature to only realize it once it's been taken away from you. And that's how it was for me. You see, our perfect little family was ripped apart in the winter of 1909 when I was just 6 years old. Ma took sick with a fever, and she died on Christmas Day. Just like that, I had lost the most important person in my life, and I was devastated. Paul, on the other hand, couldn't take care of 2 young children on his own, and by the following summer, he had married a widow who had 4 children of her own. Within a couple years, Paul and my new stepmother had 2 children of their own. All of a sudden, there were now 3 different sets of kids in that one-room cabin. And I'll tell you this right now, that woman made it clear to my sister and I that we were not her children. We were always treated second class, and we would do without clothes and shoes until her children got theirs first. I even had to give up my bed so that her kids could sleep on it while I slept on the floor each night. I began to spend much of my time outside, trying to stay away from her as much as possible. I had 3 dogs that had become my best friends. Now, I know it sounds strange, but it seemed like they understood me, and I understood them. I trained them how to tree coons and hunt rabbits. I even trained a German Shepherd to stay on point during quail hunts. Speaking of hunting, I had an uncanny ability of shooting. I got my first gun when I was 8, a Remington rifle, and I made it a habit of killing more rabbits and squirrels with that rifle than my pa could with his shotgun. I learned to shoot from instinct. I didn't shoulder the gun and aim. I shot from the hip. I would enter a shooting contest with the men from our area, shooting turkeys that were tied behind a log. We would stand at 50 yards and take turns shooting at the turkey's head each time it popped up. Whoever could hit that turkey's head would get to keep that turkey as a prize. I won so many times that the old-timers wouldn't enter a contest if I was in it. One day, when I was 14, one of my stepbrothers stole a knife that my ma had given me for Christmas before she died. Oh, we got into a fight, and I punched him. And for that, my stepmother began to beat me. And then she took a hammer and began smashing the knife until she broke the blade in half. In that moment, I knew that I couldn't live in that cabin any longer. I grabbed my rifle and my dogs, and I set out on my own. Just like that, my childhood was over. I followed the creek through the mountains for the next couple of days before I arrived in Clinchport, Virginia. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, and all the Hills folk had come to town to see the Richard Brothers traveling circus. Workers were busy setting up tents, while others tended to wagons loaded with canvas and poles that held up the big top. I had never seen so much hustle and bustle in all my life. I approached one of the straw bosses, and I asked if they needed an extra hand. And just like that, I was hired for $35 a month and even had a place to sleep if I could find one. Now my job was to set up and tear down the tents and drive a team of 4 mules loaded with equipment from town to town over the mountain roads. Each night, me and my dogs would sleep on a pile of canvas in the back of the wagon under the stars. Food, on the other hand, was scarce, and many times the boss would cut my pay, always promising that he'd make it up to me in the next town. But you see, he was a drunk, and oftentimes he could be violent. One morning, I didn't get out of bed as quick as he thought I ought to, so he woke me up by hitting me over the head with the butt of his pistol. It was like that from time to time. During my first year with the circus, we traveled through Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia. One night in Alabama, I finally caught a break. You see, the fella who was the trick shot performer in the show was passed out stone cold drunk when it was his time to perform. The straw boss had heard that I was a crack shot, and in desperation, he decided to put me out there in front of the crowd. The boss man pulled me aside and said, "Look here, kid, here's a pistol, and we're going to put a lit cigarette in this fella here's mouth, and you're going to shoot the lid end off of it, okay? Oh, and kid, whatever you do, don't kill him. It's his first week on the job." A few seconds later, as someone was putting a cowboy hat on my head and a gun belt around my waist, I heard the circus leader address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, and now for the final act of the evening. Please welcome, all the way from El Paso, Texas, the 4-time United States shooting champion, Cowboy Kenny." And just as someone was pushing me from behind the curtain, out in front of the roaring crowd, the boss man grabbed my hand and said, "Here, kid, here's 3 walnuts. I'm going to need you to toss them all in the air at once and shoot them before they hit the ground. Now, don't let me down, kid. If you can pull it off, I'll find a spot for you in the show." Heck, I'd been tossing chestnuts in the air and shooting them for years. I knew I could do this. As I walked center stage, the crowd suddenly went quiet. I looked out in front of me and saw a fella light a Marlboro cigarette. He took a few puffs off of it, and then he gave me a wink, indicating he was ready, even though I saw a streak of sweat trickling down his face. Now, I wasn't exactly sure what the sequence was that I was supposed to perform the tricks, so I took the 3 walnuts and I tossed them straight up and fired. Each exploded into pieces as I plucked them out of the sky, and as my pistol followed the pieces down, without even stopping, I shot the fire right out of that fella's mouth, leaving nothing but a cigarette filter. The crowd went wild. Just like that, I became the featured performing act in the circus from that moment on. I spent the next few years shooting walnuts and cigarettes and even buttons off of folks' shirts, and I gained a reputation as one of the best shooters in America. Yet, during this time, the boss man continued to rip me off my money and take advantage of me. One night, after a show in Mississippi, I saw him kick one of my dogs when the circus was pulling out for the night, and I didn't go with him. By now, I was 21 years old, and I took a job working for a lumber company. Now, this was during Prohibition, and nearly every man had a part-time job, either making or selling moonshine. Heck, as far as I was concerned, moonshine had flowed just as freely as the water back in Virginia, so I didn't see anything wrong with it. And, as it turns out, the good sheriff didn't think there was anything wrong with it either, since he was running the biggest operation of illegal moonshine in South Mississippi. He hired me as a runner. Before long, I spent nearly every night delivering white mule. The lawman liked my work ethic, and many times, instead of money, he would pay me with goods that he had confiscated during his arrest. Heck, one night he even gave me a big fancy watch. Things were finally going good for me. I had a good paying job at the logging mill, and I was in the good graces of the law. But before long, the FBI began investigating the good sheriff for his illegal distillery operation. And wouldn't you know it, the sheriff pinned it all on me and promptly arrested me for stealing the watch that he had given me. Now, you see, I had never been arrested in my life, and I wasn't about to lay down and just take the fall for the sheriff. And that night, I overpowered the guard, and I stole a horse and escaped the jail. I immediately went home and grabbed my guns and my dogs, and I made up my mind to get out of Mississippi just as soon as possible. However, newspapers ran my story and the supposed crimes all over the area, and everyone was looking for me. So I found an abandoned house and decided to lay low for a few months, especially since winter was approaching. At daybreak on Christmas Eve of 1924, my dogs woke me up. They seemed to have heard something outside, and within a few moments, a voice shouted, "Kenny Wagner, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." I immediately got up and threw my pants on and stuck my pistol in my belt. I was still barefooted when I opened the door to try to talk some reason into the situation. No sooner than I cracked the door, the sheriff shot me in the midsection. I fell back inside the house. The bullet had struck my pistol, taking much of the impact and blowing the handle off of it. But I was still wounded and bleeding bad. In that moment, I saw my 12-gauge shotgun leaning in the corner. I quickly grabbed it and decided to make a run for the woods out the back door. No sooner than I went out the back, bullets started flying, kicking up dirt all around me. It was all surreal, and time seemed to slow down. How was this happening? I wasn't a violent man, and I knew very well that the Bible said thou shalt not kill. But I also knew that there was nothing in the good book that said you couldn't defend yourself when someone was trying to kill you. Without even thinking, while I was running full speed towards the swamp, the sheriff cocked his pistol and began aiming at me. I unloaded both barrels of that shotgun, hitting him in the shoulder and the chest, killing the lawman instantly. I disappeared, barefooted into the woods. Just like that, I was wanted for murder with a $1,000 bounty, wanted dead or alive, put on my head. And by the next day, a 100-man posse with bloodhounds were tracking me. But I knew how to make my way through the wilderness since I had grown up in Appalachia. Before long, I had made my way on foot, traveling the back roads and the trails until I got to Birmingham, Alabama, where I bought a horse and made my way to East Tennessee. There, my sister caught up with me and gave me some money and supplies. We met in a secluded area of Kingsport, Tennessee, at the fork of the Holston River. It was the first time we'd seen each other in years, and neither of us could believe how this all happened. Yet, by now, my face had been plastered on newspapers all over America, and it turns out someone recognized me and called the cops. And while we were sitting there eating, I looked up and saw police officers approaching from 3 sides. There were 5 of them. We quickly got up and started walking away from them to avoid a confrontation, when suddenly bullets started flying. We both ran as fast as we could. Bullets were kicking up mud on her dress, and one bullet clipped her hair. Again, in pure survival instinct, I pulled out my pistol. I shot one cop straight on. Just then, another was firing at me from behind, so I shot him over my left shoulder before spinning around and shooting the 3rd cop. The other 2 cops turned tail and ran. But the damage was done. Within the span of just a couple of months, I had killed 3 cops and severely wounded a 4th in Mississippi and Tennessee. The next day, I decided to turn myself in. Yet, when details of my story and crimes hit the newspapers, many of the public seemed to agree that I was only acting in self-defense. And wouldn't you know it, thousands of dollars began pouring in from all over America to pay for my legal defense, mostly from women. Now, the wheels of the justice system turned much quicker back then, and my case went to trial in April of 1925. And, despite a top-notch defense team, I was found guilty of first-degree murder for killing those 2 Tennessee cops and sentenced to death by the electric chair. My defense team quickly appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court. But me? There was no use sticking around to see how that was going to turn out. Within a month, I had broken out of jail and was on the run again. I decided to get as far away from Tennessee as I could. Once I crossed the Mississippi River, it was a brand new world, but there were no mountains, and traveling was made easy. Before long, I had traveled through the desert of Texas, where the only thing I had to worry about was rattlesnakes and hunger. One day, I stumbled upon a Mexican wagon train that was hauling oil to a mine about 18 miles from the border, and even though they couldn't understand a word I said, they gave me a ride. I decided to try my luck in Mexico, so I swam across the Rio Grande River, past Border Patrol. But once I got there, I almost died of thirst in the mountains. The only water that saved my life was the dirtiest, nastiest puddle of water you ever saw, but I drank it. I managed to stay in Mexico for a year, but before long, they got to thinking I was a spy, and I had to fight my way back towards the American border. I was shot twice and had 2 horses shot from underneath me trying to get out of there. I managed to get back past Border Patrol, and I made my way to San Angelo, Texas, where I caught a ride with a busload of Mexican cotton pickers, headed for northwest Louisiana. I worked for a while there before I made my way into Arkansas, and I got a job working on a farm in Texarkana. One night, I found myself in a poker game with 4 brothers who were deep into a whiskey bottle and didn't take too kindly to me taking all their money. Before I knew it, one of them hit me over the head with a pistol, knocking me unconscious. And while I was out, they kicked 2 of my teeth out, and then went back to playing cards. When I came to, I tried to crawl out the door. One of them looked up and said, "That bastard's still moving," and fired a shot at me. Before I knew it, I'd pulled my pistol out of my pants and shot 2 of them dead, and wounded the 3rd while the 4th one escaped. Now I had a $2,500 bounty on my head, and a posse of 100 men looking for me in Arkansas. That night, I was hiding in the woods as I heard several of the posse members approaching. I pulled my pistol out, ready to strike first this time. Yet, to my surprise, the first person I saw leading the way was a woman. You see, it turns out the sheriff of Miller County, Arkansas, had recently been killed in a moonshine raid gone wrong, and his wife was serving as sheriff in his place. And me? I had too much respect for a woman to ever harm one. In that moment, I stepped out of the bushes and surrendered to her. So you see, by 1926, the law had finally caught up with the notorious outlaw, Kenny Wagner, and at the hands of a woman sheriff. When he was asked about it, Kenny was reported to have said, "Oh, I'm too much of a gentleman to ever raise a hand against any woman." However, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas were arguing over who was going to get to try Kenny for his murders. And in the end, Mississippi won out, where Kenny Wagner was tried and convicted for killing the crooked moonshine sheriff and promptly sentenced to life in prison at Parchman Penitentiary, deep in the cotton fields of Sunflower County, Mississippi. But hold on now, that's not the end of the story. You see, Kenny was a good-looking fella, 6 feet tall, with an athletic build, charming brown eyes, and a winning smile. Ladies loved him, and men thought of him as a folklore hero. So much so that 3 songs were written about him and topped the charts during the 1920s, and the prison was flooded nearly every day from women all across America wanting to marry him. So many visitors came to visit him every day that Kenny finally got another prisoner who favored him a bit to stand in for him so he could focus on writing love letters back to all the ladies. And before long, he had charmed the prison guards too. So much so that they made him a trustee, and they allowed Kenny to start training all of the bloodhounds to track prisoners. Kenny was so good in the woods that the guards started bringing him along to capture prisoners who tried to escape through the swamps and the woods. You see, during this time, Parchman didn't have enough paid guards, so they would arm the prisoner trustees with rifles and even machine guns to help keep the other prisoners in line. It seems Kenny was truly a reformed man, and before you knew it, he had his very own machine gun that he took out to help the guards track prisoners. The governor of Mississippi took notice of how many prisoners Kenny had tracked and returned and began rewarding the reformed outlaw with 10-day prison pardons during Christmas so Kenny could catch up with all his family and lady friends. And so it was until 1940. Kenny was 14 years into his life sentence when one night he was out with a prison guard with a car load of bloodhounds searching for an escapee on a dark gravel back road. The two were in deep philosophical talk. Kenny spoke up. "You know, sir, the longer I live, I've realized that you can never trust people. I tell you, it's true. The more time I spend with dogs, the less I trust people." "That's a good point you make, Kenny," the guard replied when he noticed something sticking into his side. In that moment, he realized that Kenny was pointing his pistol at him. He pulled the car over, and Kenny disappeared into the woods. When the guard unleashed the dogs to track the fugitive, every dog simply laid down and wouldn't move, since Kenny had spent the past 14 years teaching each one of them how to not track him. Kenny spent the next 3 years a free man until the FBI arrested him. Back to Parchman Penitentiary he went, where once again he was so trustworthy and loyal that they made him a trustee and put him back to training the bloodhounds and gave him yearly 10-day Christmas paroles. Then one day in 1948, Kenny simply walked out of the prison gate with his government-issued machine gun and escaped again. Once again, the bloodhounds had been trained not to track him. The outlaw would remain on the run for the next 8 years when a jealous man tipped off the FBI to his whereabouts in Scobie, Mississippi. So in 1956, Kenny went back to Parchman Penitentiary for the third and final time, where once again they allowed him to train dogs. But you see, by now, Kenny was a sick man, suffering from serious heart and liver conditions. So he spent the next 2 years in and out of the prison hospital. By 1958, Kenny was very weak and bedridden at the hospital. However, his favorite dog, Queen, had just had puppies. So he talked to prison officials into letting him go see his dog one last time. Kenny petted Queen and then reached down to pick up one of the 2-day-old puppies. In that moment, he was so overcome with joy and emotion that his weak heart stopped beating and he collapsed dead from a heart attack. 4 days later, Kenny Wagner, the notorious outlaw who had outwitted the law for nearly 4 decades, was laid to rest in Gate City, Virginia, where over 15,000 people from all across America came to pay their last respects at his funeral. To this day, many folks say Kenny was just born in the wrong century. Had he lived back in the great pioneer days, Kenny's guns might have played an important role in winning the West. His name might have been mentioned along with other great men such as Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Wyatt Earp, and Buffalo Bill. What about you, my friend? What do you think about Kenny? Was he an outlaw, a hero, or somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments below. And make sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more true stories on Appalachia's past.
My name is John Wright, and I was born in 1844 in Letcher County, Kentucky, just off the Gibson branch of Defeated Creek. We lived on the same homestead that my grandpa had settled at the turn of the 18th century. Like Grandpap, my pa was a farmer, raising all our food and using his hands to build anything that the family might need, because it was a land of make it do or do without. Like most folks during those days, we had a large family, and the never-ending work on the farm kept all us young'uns busy, either helping Ma with the chickens and housework, or out in the field with Pa. In school, well, it was mostly an afterthought, since we only went to school about 2 months a year, and we didn't even have any books. So, like all mountain boys back then, whenever I wasn't working around the farm, I spent all my time fishing and hunting, exploring the woods, and learning all I could about the animals. But most of all, you could always find me with my best friend, a horse named Buck that my pa had gave me when I was a young boy. Buck and I rode all over Pine Mountain, chasing rabbits and bobcats. I got to where I could track a deer or any other animal through thick laurels or pasture land alike. It didn't matter where they tried to hide. I began to understand how the animals thought when they were roaming the woods, and I developed an instinct and a knack for predicting their next moves. Folks said I was one of the best riders in the county, but the truth is, horses just seemed to trust me more than most folks. And when I was in the saddle, they were calm and steady, and I talked to them like they understood me. My brothers always said I was crazy for it, but I could see in Buck's eyes that he knew what I meant. I got to where I started doing some trick riding on him. I'd set up a target on a tree, and Buck would run circles around the tree in a full gallop, while I rode Indian style, firing my revolver. I got to where I could hit the bullseye nearly every time. We jumped creeks and rail fences, chased rabbits, and even sometimes in the evening, we'd go up to the old burying ground where Papa and Mama were, and Buck and I would just watch the sunset. Looking back, I wouldn't have wanted to grown up any other way. Life was perfect on our little farm. For me, I'd grown up woods wise and mountain tough, and few could equal my cunningness or my courage to apply it. Anyways, the outside world began creeping in towards our little farm. There'd been trouble brewing between the northern and the southern states for as long as anybody could remember. We had even heard rumors of war for years. And by 1861, the unthinkable happened, and those rumors became a reality when the war between the states broke out. Before you knew it, there were Union and Confederate recruiters roaming the hills, looking for any able-bodied man
that would fight for them. And while many folks felt a calling to fight for one side or the other, there were many Scotch-Irish folks like us who didn't take too kindly to being forced to fight for any government. And even though my family didn't particularly care for war at all, in 1862, I turned 18 and I got sucked into the Civil War, fighting for the 13th Kentucky Cavalry in the Confederate Army. Life changed drastically when the Civil War erupted, sweeping through the hills and valleys of our homeland like a wildfire. In 1863, I was still a private, and we were stationed in Wise, Virginia, when Union forces surrounded the town and launched into an all-out attack. We were badly outnumbered, but we held them off as long as we could. Yet soon we were overrun. There was just too many of them, and we were forced to retreat inside of the county courthouse as a last stand. But it was no use. We were surrounded with soldiers equipped with torches. We had no choice, either surrender or be burned alive. And as we marched out into the streets, we were forced to lay down our rifles on the ground and surrender. There was this Union captain riding up and down in front of our men, calling us cowards and yellow. And me, I'd never been called that in my life. And truth be known, if I'd been in charge, I don't believe I would have ever surrendered. I can't tell you what came over me in that moment, but as soon as the captain slowly rode up in front of me and spit at my boots, without even thinking, I pulled a concealed pistol from my belt and I shot him off that horse. Before anyone could even react, I was on his horse and galloping down the main street, clinging to the side of the beast, Indian style, as a hailstorm of bullets rang out and whizzed by me. But somehow in that moment, faced with death, I had never felt so alive.
Hey guys, J.D. Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and I hope you're enjoying this true story about the life of Devil John Wright. Click the link below to check out my brand new book, which is packed full of stories just like the one you're listening to now. And now, back to the story.
For the next couple months, I kept riding that horse southwest to get as far as I could, and before long, I ran into the Mississippi River and began following it south. By May of 1863, I met up with the Pemberton-led Confederate forces in Vicksburg, and as fate would have it, all hell broke loose. Within a few weeks of my arrival, once again, we were badly outnumbered. This time, there were 77,000 Union forces against barely 30,000 Confederates. It was a spectacle I'll never forget. A sea of bloodthirsty humans and a sky nearly darkened with gunpowder and cannon smoke filled the battlefield. I knew this wasn't going to end well. So, by the third night, I mounted my horse and tried to make an escape when suddenly I felt a burning pain in my hip. And then I heard the eruption of gunfire. I was filled with adrenaline as I made my way back out of range towards the river. And by the time the sun rose, I'd patched up my wound and decided to head back north. But before I'd even gone a quarter of a mile, I ran up upon some poor soldier who'd been killed in action. And there I saw he still had a beautiful revolver in his side holster. And well, seeing as he didn't have any more use for it, I relieved him of it and made my way back towards Kentucky. By 1864, I had joined up with the Morgan's Raiders just in time for the Battle of Cynthiana, where I was shot by some bastard with a shotgun who wounded me bad. I lost so much blood that I thought I was going to die. But when I woke up the next day, all I could see was sky, and it took a minute for me to realize that I was laying on a bed of straw in the back of a wagon. A farmer had picked me up and brought me back to his home, where his family nursed me back to health over the next few months. And while I was there, I spent as much time as possible with his daughter. By the time I was healed, she was madly in love with me, and with child. But me, I had to ramble on. The war was calling again, but this time I signed up for the Union side. You see, by 1864, the war was nearing its end, and there was a shortage of men willing to volunteer to go and die. So the government wrote a new law allowing rich men who were drafted into the conflict the right to pay another man to take their place. And like I said, I didn't care much for either army, but the price was right. So just like that, I was wearing the blue instead of the gray. In the days that followed the war between the states, killing just had to be done. Nearly every man was a veteran who would kill another man at the drop of a hat, and many were basically just mercenaries for hire, for businessmen who needed to protect their assets, their stores, and their farms. Truth be told, I wasn't any different. There were too many horse thieves, cutthroats, and robbers, but I never shot until I had to shoot. I always gave a man a chance for his life, and if he wanted to surrender, well, all right. But if his hand went towards his gun, I was out with mine before he could, and I always got my man. But I tell you, the worst news came to me when I found out that several members of my family had been murdered while I was away during the war. First, my brother and his wife had been killed after their home was burned to the ground, leaving them homeless and hungry. And one night, they stole a piece of cornbread from a wealthy farmer, and when he caught them, he shot and killed them both. And then a group of bushwhackers killed my cousins while they slept in their beds, before stealing everything they owned. When Paul told me about it, he said it was best just to let it go. But in my eyes, that wasn't an option. And the first thing I did, I saddled up my horse and rode 160 miles in 4 days to Virginia to find the man who had killed my brother and his wife. On the 4th day, I found him leaning on a fence, talking to 3 other men. I simply rode up and I asked, "Are you Irvin Hill?" "Well, that's right, I am. What business is it to you, stranger?" And without another word, I pulled my pistol that I had taken off the dead soldier on the banks of the Mississippi River, and I shot him dead. I tipped my hat to the other men who stood there silent, and I rode back to Kentucky, where I rounded up the 3 bushwhackers who had robbed and killed my cousins, and I hung all 3 of them from an oak tree. When the law heard what I had done, they sent a group of men to arrest me, led by the deputy sheriff, and they finally caught up with me on Troublesome Creek. "John Wright, son, you're under arrest for the murder of Irvin Hill." And after the lawman finished speaking, I asked him, "Did you send a warrant for Mr. Hill when he murdered my brother and his wife?" "No, sir, we didn't, but that don't matter. And anyways, you're coming with us." And to me, that logic didn't make a lick of sense. So I replied, "Well, fellas, it looks like we got ourselves a disagreement." Just then, one of the men pulled his and aimed a fire, but in a flash, I shot all 3 of them. And when the smoke cleared, I saw that I had accidentally killed the deputy sheriff's horse. And I tell you, I felt awful about that. So I sent a payment back to the sheriff, along with my apologies for shooting such a fine animal. Speaking of horses, there was a huge shortage of them after the war, and all those that were available would fetch $200 or more, and that was a fortune back in those days. So it was no wonder that horse thieves were everywhere. Outlaws from all over converged on Kentucky, stealing horses and taking them over the state line and selling them in West Virginia. By now, I had gotten a reputation as a man who wasn't afeared of working on either side of the law if the money was right. I'd worked with the coal companies to get folks to sell their land to them, and I'd worked with the miners during armed rebellions against those same coal companies, fighting for better wages. Once, I even rode to New York City to recover money for a farmer who was ripped off by one of those coal companies. Not that I ever gave him his money back, since I kept it for myself, but at least that farmer had the satisfaction of knowing that his money wasn't a-laying in that coal man's pocket. I was literally for hire for anyone for the right price. And What little time I wasn't spending fighting for my own brand of justice, I was spending with the ladies. You see, I'd become quite the ladies' man, standing 6'1", with shiny black hair, a quick smile, and a smooth talker. And I had no problem with the ladies, or for that matter, making babies. Married, engaged, or single, I loved them all. I once had a warrant for my arrest for dating a married woman, and once I was dating 2 sisters at the same time who both happened to give me beautiful sons. Heck, I already had a passel of young'uns, 14 of them by the time I was 22. That's right, I was a lover and a fighter. In 1866, I was offered a job working for the John Robinson Circus as a trick rider and a trick shooter. I could plug a target 6 times while riding Indian style, hanging on the side of a horse and firing from underneath his neck. I could ride a horse while standing on my head, with or without a saddle, pound off the back of a running horse, catch its tail, and leap right back in the saddle. I traveled all over America and Europe, even performing for the Queen of England before returning home to Kentucky. Yet, things were still rough in the mountains. Outlaws everywhere a man looked, and most times they were armed better than the law. Once, some local lawmen asked me to help them bring a desperado in, a horse thief that was a bad man. It was early in the morning, and we tracked him to a farmhouse where he was hiding out. And wouldn't you know it, he was sound asleep in his bed when we walked through the door. But he woke up in a foul mood and pulled a pistol from under his pillow and opened fire, killing both lawmen and whizzing a bullet by my ear that exploded and splintered the door next to me. And for that, I shot him dead. A few years later, I helped trace some rascals, and somehow my name became known far and wide. And Pinkerton Detective Agency offered me a job in Virginia. I worked for them for some time, catching outlaws and thieves, but they treated me dirty. You see, they always put me on the meanest, hardest cases there was. And once I got my man, the agency would try to keep all the reward money. But I was nobody's fool. So I offered my resignation, and they refused. So I politely pulled my pistol and pointed it at the back of the boss's head. And suddenly, he seemed tickled to let me go. But right away, I was offered a job working for the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in Charleston, West Virginia. Once, I went with 2 county officers to catch a horse thief. And you better believe this dude was a bad man. We looked for him for weeks, when one day we found him in broad daylight at a shoe shop. Seeing our opportunity to arrest him, the officers with me suddenly got a bad case of weak knees, and they left me by myself to face the outlaw. But I went in anyhow. There he was, stooped over a bench with his gun next to him. But I didn't want him to know that I was with the law, so I kept my gun in my pocket. Yet, as soon as he realized I was there to arrest him, he grabbed his gun, shooting at me twice. But luckily, he missed. It all happened so fast, I didn't have time to pull the pistol out of my pants. So, I just shot him right through my pocket, blowing a hole in my jeans and his chest at the same time. Another time, I was hunting a young horse thief in West Virginia in a town named Beckley that was full of horse thieves. Heck, I even disguised myself as a horse thief just to fit in. I ended up staying at a boarding house with an old man, hoping I would learn the whereabouts of the wanted man. But after several weeks, I hadn't learned a single thing. However, the detective agency hadn't heard from me in a while, and they began to believe I was dead. And soon, they were hunting for my body. And that day, the old man that owned the house came in and said, "There's some men in town looking for a fella named John Wright." So I replied, "Is that right? Well, John Wright is a detective, and that scoundrel's been after me. He must be somewhere close in these parts. Come to think of it, if you'll help me lay low, I'll pay you an extra $20 a week as a thank you." Hearing that, the old man began taking real good care to protect me. And one day, he came to me down in the cellar, and he sat down on a box as he twisted his beard. "Son, how'd you like to have a partner?" "Well, I don't really care much about one, since I've been making it mighty fine by myself. And the way I figure, it's safer to be alone," I replied. And just then he continued, "I'm not talking about just any partner. I'm talking about an expert partner, one who has a hideout that can never be found by the law." "Well, I wouldn't mind having a safe place when I'm not stealing horses," I said, "but I prefer to be alone." "Well, the reason I mention it to you is my boy has been thieving horses for years, and I tell you, he's real good at it, scouting and hiding and always staying one step ahead of the law, just like yourself, you know. Anyways, I told him about you, and he'd like to meet you. How about I take you up to his hideout tonight?" And to that I replied, "Well, that's mighty kind of you." And that night, we went up a rugged patch of mountains, and then down into a deep holler, before coming to a cave that was lit with lanterns. There, sitting at a bench, was a young stalwart fella, making harnesses, and there beside him was a revolver. He stood to welcome me. Then he sat back down and continued his work. Anyhow, the old man just left me there, and he would drop by every night to bring us food. Now, I knew that this was the man I was hunting, but he was a cunning fella, and I never had a single chance to get the drop on him, since he always had his gun with him. And after a few days, I couldn't take being cooped up in that cave all day, so I started taking hunting trips in the mountains around it. Usually, I'd bring back a few squirrels or a rabbit, and we would roast them over the campfire. One day, I came in with a batch of squirrels, and I found the thief at his bench, oiling up his gun, which just happened to be empty. The time was right, so I jerked my gun from its holster and I said, "You're under arrest." But that bastard threw his gun at me and hit me in the face. Before I knew it, he was all over me, fists flying and boots a-kicking. And I tell you, we fought all over that cave for 3/4 of an hour, fighting over my gun, when finally I was able to shove that rascal off of me, and I put that barrel right on his temple. Suddenly, he calmed down just long enough for me to handcuff him, and to that he replied, "You old devil, you ain't nothing but a devil." And so it was. From that day forth, everybody began calling the mountain boy from Kentucky Devil John Wright. From 1870 to 1910, the devil tracked hundreds of outlaws and thieves all over Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Fugitives always said that having Bad John on your trail was just like having a hellhound after you, and he wouldn't stop at nothing to get his man. That's right, Devil John Wright never let his man get away. He was a mainstay of law and order in the Cumberland Mountains, even if he was a little shady himself. His word was law, and he was the king of the hills. Mountaineers feared and respected him. Once, an entire gang, armed to the teeth, took over a courtroom in Hazard, Kentucky, and wouldn't allow the judge to hold a murder trial against one of their posse members, Outlaw Jack Combs. The judge sent word for Devil John, and the next day in court, the entire courtroom was shut down once again by the outlaws. But when John Wright walked through the door and took a seat, you could have heard a pin drop when he said, "Judge, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to sit here a while you have court." Just like that, court resumed without a single peep from the gang. Devil John once caught the notorious outlaw, Will Waller, who had held off a whole town from a tiny shack behind the Whitesburg, Kentucky jail. John just strolled up to the door and said, "Will, come on now and open up that door. Come out here and quit acting a fool." But for John's trouble, the wanted man just fired a few cuss words at him and then a bullet by John's head. And for that, John shot the lock off the door and promptly arrested the man. Even outlaws loved him. One of Devil John's most prized possessions was a pistol that Jesse James gave him as a gift for helping his gang travel over the Cumberland Mountains into Tennessee. And so it was, at the age of 74, Devil John Wright, Civil War veteran, master horseman, federal detective, lawman, and part-time outlaw, finally settled down to Pound, Virginia in 1910. He had killed 28 outlaws in the line of duty and fathered 27 children in his spare time. He always said his one regret was that he didn't bring in as many souls into this world as he took out. John Wright was immortalized in the best-selling book of 1908, Trail of the Lonesome Pine, by John Fox. The main character of the book, Devil Judd, is based on the real-life character of Devil John Wright. Even in his old age, John never stopped riding horses. It was said that when he was in his 80s, he was still as active as a man in his 30s. Heck, he was even made deputy sheriff in Wise County, Virginia, when he was 86 years old. But perhaps the most iconic moment of Devil John Wright's incredible life came on July 24th, 1929, when he was laid down beneath the waters of Cedar Creek at the Primitive Baptist Church in Pound, Virginia. Nearly 2,000 people came from all over to witness the historic event, including several of John's enemies, to see if they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. And it was true. He was born again, and he refused to let anyone call him Devil John for the rest of his life, which was only a few short months later when Devil John died in 1931. Now, my friend, you know the true story of Devil John Wright.
Coming in at number 3, one man versus 400 cops in the mountains, Appalachia's Rambo. I've heard it said that a man is either born in these mountains or he spends his whole life trying to get to them. I guess you could say that was the case with me. It was just like the old folks used to claim, ain't no use in trying to stop destiny. You see, I cut my teeth in the swamps of North Carolina, but as it turned out, it would be these mountains of Appalachia that define my life and my legacy that still sends shockwaves across those hills and hollers. But we'll get to that soon enough. My name is Michael John Schnornock. I was born in Carteret County, just outside the sleepy coastal town of Swainsboro, North Carolina. In many ways, my parents were drifters, moving from state to state in search of a better life. So I guess you could say I was pretty good at quickly adapting to new surroundings. It was here in the rich lowlands that Paul tried his hand at farming on a rented patch of land, while I spent my time exploring the creeks and the rivers. Now, there was plenty to do for a curious boy. Crabbing, shrimping, and clamming. I loved the outdoors, and I loved to camp for days at a time in the Croatan National Forest. One day, I hiked a few miles deep into the woods, following old animal trails, when I ran upon a makeshift camp. It was here that I met a lady who'd been living off the grid for decades, all alone with her animals. She had withdrawn from society and survived by hunting and fishing. I was fascinated by her lifestyle, and we quickly became friends. Over the next few years, I would spend weeks at a time in her camp, where she taught me how to track animals, build weapons like blowguns and bow and arrows, and how to shoot guns, and how to completely disappear in the woods. And these turned out to be the skills that would define my life. By the time I was 18, I was an expert outdoorsman in every sense of the word. I couldn't stand to be cooped up in a building. I needed to be outside. I took up carpentry work, and I bounced around between North Carolina and Florida from job to job, and many times paycheck to paycheck. Yet, no matter where I was, I would always gravitate towards the nearest wilderness area, disappearing into the mountains or some swamp for weeks at a time. I was just so restless and free-spirited. For the most part, I just wanted folks to leave me alone. And it was about this time that I began to have a few run-ins with the law. First, it started with traffic stops and tickets, and it seemed like I could never catch a break when it came to cops. They just didn't like me. And if the truth be told, I didn't like them. Each traffic stop would always turn into a confrontation with some random cop demanding respect just because he had a government badge pinned across his chest. And me, I'd look him right in the eye and tell him to go to hell. It seemed like something changed in me. I started to resist all forms of any authority, and I became fearless. Once, I saw a brand new Chevy Monte Carlo with the keys in the ignition sitting at a car lot. I don't know what came over me, but I hopped right in, and I drove it like it was mine. I loved the adrenaline rush I felt as my hands gripped the wheel, listening to those pipes scream as I roared down the highway. It was addicting because a few weeks later, I stole a Jeep just for fun, and I led state troopers on a 27-mile chase before I pulled over and jumped into a river and swam to a small island where I was captured a few hours later and jailed. And that night, I escaped police custody again, and I was on the run in the woods for 3 days before the cops finally caught up with me. Just like that, I was sent to prison for 3 years. By August 1986, I was 21 years old, just paroled, and a changed man. Prison will do that to a fella. I had a bitterness in my heart and a burning desire to get even. I still remember the day I got out of prison. My mama looked at me and she said, "Son, that look in your eyes, it scares me. I don't even know who you are anymore." And I told her right then to be ready because my trouble with the law was just beginning. And I swore to her that they would never catch me again. By September, I had quit my construction job, and I failed to report to my parole officer, and a warrant was issued for my arrest. But that was the least of my problems. You see, I once again had led cops on a 3-county car chase when they tried to execute their warrant. It lasted all the way to nightfall, when I ditched my stolen car and disappeared into the Croatan National Forest. The next day, they had a dozen dogs in a helicopter combing the woods looking for me. But by then, I had stole a 14-foot boat with a 25-horsepower engine, and I was long gone. For the next 4 weeks, I traveled by water back down to Florida, but I needed money and food pretty bad, so I robbed a pawn shop and I stole 10 guns. And then I robbed a restaurant at gunpoint in Wrightsville Beach and a pizza place down in Brunswick, Georgia. By the time I made it to Central Florida, I was spotted at Port Orange, where I was trying to steal some gas at a marina, and I was spotted by the cops. I dove into the water, and I managed to swim away, but I was still desperate and still needed food. So I camped outside a home, and I waited until morning when I saw a man drive away, headed to work. I didn't see any lights on in the house, so I figured it was empty, and I broke in through a window where I was greeted by a pit bull who was attacking my leg, so I shot him. It was then that I heard a scream, and I realized that the man's wife was still home. I told her I wouldn't hurt her, but I needed food, so she warmed up some spaghetti from the previous night. And after I ate, I stole a motorcycle from the garage, and I was on the run again. Before long, a highway patrolman pulled me over in Brevard County, Florida, and I was tired of playing games. I reached into my jacket to pull my pistol, but before I could, the deputy fired at me from behind his car door. But he missed, and I darted into the sawgrass and disappeared yet again
despite a 2-day search from helicopters and bloodhounds. By now, there seemed to be no turning back for Michael John Shornock. He was a convicted felon on the run who had just committed a string of armed robberies, including holding a woman hostage in her home, and he had evaded 2 manhunts by police in North Carolina and Florida. Yet, despite their efforts, the wanted man was nowhere to be found before he resurfaced a month later in Cape Carteret, North Carolina, where he robbed a bank and shot 2 police officers during his escape. Now, he was tired of running up and down the eastern coast. So, the fugitive stole a car and he headed for the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina for a final showdown that would captivate the nation. On the morning of November 22nd, 1986, Shornock's stolen Buick was spotted in Edneyville, where he was flinging an empty beer bottle out onto the highway. When the highway patrolman attempted to pull the fugitive over, Shornock pointed his .357 Magnum out the driver's side window, and he blew a hole clean through the windshield of the highway patrolman's car. In that moment, Michael John Shornock exited his car dressed in full military camouflage with several weapons, including a machine gun strapped across his back, and he disappeared into the woods of Sugarloaf Mountain. For the next 4 days, nearly 450 cops from 30 different law agencies would comb this mountain looking for what every newspaper in America was calling the search for the real Rambo. Roadblocks were placed on every paved and dirt road leading up to Sugarloaf. Every vehicle was searched by armed law enforcement anytime anyone attempted to go up or down the mountain. 12 families were evacuated and forced to leave their homes during the manhunt. Yet, many mountaineers refused to leave and simply loaded every rifle and shotgun and vowed to protect their homesteads at all cost. Armed guards were seated on the front of every school bus taking children to school. Police set up outposts on every side of the mountain and formed a human wall surrounding the mountain as the largest manhunt in North Carolina history was underway. But there was a thick fog that had settled on the mountain, so thick that one cop said he could only see the tail wagging from his canine on the end of his 15-foot leash. All helicopters and planes were grounded due to zero visibility. It didn't matter, though. Dozens of officers set out into the thick mountain laurel and ravines only to be welcomed by Shornock, because this was his turf. And it seems that he knew all officers were wearing bulletproof vests, so he shot for their heads, firing off nearly 50 rounds from a machine gun, blowing a hole clean through a special agent's face, and shooting another highway patrol, only to have the bullet ricochet off the officer's firearm, saving his life. The battle lines were drawn, and Shornock wasn't backing down, and the outlaw didn't appear to be running from the law. Instead, he was waiting for him. Day 2 and Day 3 of the manhunt was more of the same. Heavy fog and several gun battles. Shornock had wounded 2 more officers, and they couldn't pin the wanted man down. He was cunning and seemed to know every next move the law would make, and there he would be waiting with more gunfire. By the 4th day, the fog finally broke, and the roar of single-engine search planes and the barking of anxious bloodhounds echoed through the hills. One by one, officers in uniforms and fatigues, with handguns strapped to their sides and bulletproof vests hugging their torsos, they searched the near vertical mountain. Their unshaven faces and rain-soaked clothes and bloodshot eyes told the story that the fugitive was still at large. The aircraft soon spotted in an abandoned barn in a remote area, and a team of 24 cops went to clear the area. The lawmen carefully searched each horse stable, and when it came to the last one, as soon as they opened the door, Shornock opened fire, hitting both cops as he took off running across the field. But the lawmen, you see, they had set up a perimeter around the area, and all hell broke loose. Bullets kicked up dirt all around the outlaw as he ran and dove into a ravine. Yet, within no time, the officers had flanked all sides. Shornock never stopped firing, blowing leaves and mud into the sky as he shot up the entire bank surrounding the ditch. He was determined to go out in one final blaze of glory as he refused to surrender. And during this final showdown, as most lawmen were ducking for cover, one SWAT team member managed to get behind Shornock, and he took aim. One shot rang out, shooting the renegade right through the head, and finally ending a 3-month crime spree across 4 states. Coming in at number 2, the devil is coming, and he's bringing hell with him. My name is Jim Turner, and I was born in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1836, just off the Clover Fork of the Cumberland River. My grandpa had been among the first whites to arrive here just 2 generations before, where he amassed over 5,000 acres of land and ran the only general store in the county. He had passed that fortune down to my pa, who still ran that store. And Pa was considered a good, charitable man who would help those in need, since he was one of the only men in Harlan County who paid taxes for owning a silver pocket watch. But he was also known as a ruthless and bloodthirsty to anyone who ever crossed him. You have to keep in mind that these general stores were the hubs of each community, the official headquarters of all political and religious ideology, which, truthfully, were exactly the same thing. All the powerful landowners and politicians gathered here and controlled all the commerce that flowed through the county. And any man who dared open another store in competition was not only risking his own life, but his entire family's life by doing so. Many times, competitors would try to move in, but they were quickly escorted out of the region, either on a swift horse or in a pine box. Now, many folks say that blood is thicker than water, but that isn't always the case, especially when it came to our first cousins, the Middleton family, who were also wealthy landowners. Naturally, their land adjoined ours since it had been divided from my papa's estate. Paul's sister had married one of those Middleton fellas, and that was the only reason those scoundrels had any wealth. And I tell you, there'd been a seething animosity brewing underneath the surface for years between the two factions. And it seemed like an all-out war could commence between the Turner and Middleton clans any day now. My pa was a stern religious man who was known to be the first person in his regular seat at the Methodist Church every Sunday, where he prayed to God for guidance in all spiritual affairs. Yet, it was also widely known that he would also regularly seek the counsel of moonshine and bullets for all earthly affairs. The powerful combination of the Bible and the bottle created a volatile powder keg environment in my childhood home, where my brother and I grew up as tough as barbed wire, and we quickly learned the art of gunpowder and lead. My older brother, William, was pretty level-headed in most situations, but he would quickly resort to fists and knives if the situation called for it. Me, I was much more calculating and devious. I stayed by my pa's side and followed his ways closely. Even in church, I was ordained as a minister when I was a teenager, and I'd sometimes be allowed to preach the sermons. Pa would smile with pride as I stood behind the pulpit, thumping the Bible and warning of vengeance for all our enemies. Yet, outside of the sanctuary, I was a different person. I was a budding outlaw. I had began sipping the bottle myself and stealing hogs just for the thrill. Once, I robbed an old man for $94, even though I didn't need the money. And even today, many folks believe I shot and killed him too. But the good lawyer that Paul hired proved otherwise in court. It seemed that I began to develop an appetite for destruction, and I liked the way it made me feel. I felt a power by looking down the barrel at another man, and the fear in their eyes seemed to fuel that appetite. And you might say that I was the one who lit the initial fuse for the war that would follow between my family and the Middletons. You see, when I was 15 years old, a big storm rolled through and blew down a section of the fence that divided the property between the Middleton property and ours. And wouldn't you know it, several heads of cattle belonging to the Middleton clan wandered onto our property. I took it upon myself to shoot every one of them, and two of the Middleton clan boys named Carr and David ran out with their guns and began firing at me, calling me a devil, before one bullet hit me in my arm and severely wounded me. Just like that, despite being a minister of the good book, folks started calling me Devil Jim. Now, I grew up in a time of great turmoil in America. During the years leading up to the war between the states, most places were united behind one ideology or another that underpinned the root causes of the war. But in my home state, we were completely divided on the issue, with passionate loyalties to both sides being common even within families. You see, all the states surrounding Kentucky had pledged allegiance to either the Union or the Confederacy, while Kentucky, she was torn with both Union and Confederate sympathizers when the war broke out, and both armies wanted to claim the state as their own. Both of them even included a star for Kentucky on their state flags. So both Confederate and Union armies constantly raided our state, engaging in guerrilla warfare, trying to intimidate any man who wouldn't join their cause by killing, stealing, and destroying all a man owned. Virginia was the Confederate capital, and with Harlan County bordering the state line between Kentucky and Virginia, it was ground zero for the most lawless atrocities committed during the Bloody War. Some of the most ruthless outlaws in American history earned their reputations and met their maker in this melting pot of violence. It truly was a land of kill or be killed, and only the strongest survived. It was here that I cut my teeth in the ways of the outlaw life. By the start of the war, I was 30 years old, and like every other man, I wanted to fight. Paul had sided with the South since all our money was Confederate, and I quickly signed up to fight for Confederate forces by joining Company D of the 49th Kentucky Infantry. Meanwhile, it didn't escape our eyes that worthless Middleton clan had signed up with the Union forces. But I quickly got tired of taking orders from officers, marching around, and just hanging around camp. I wanted to be where the action was, on the front lines. And to be honest, I had no personal allegiance to being a company man. I was more of a renegade, playing by my own rules. And while I appreciated the free clothes, the weapons, and the bullets that they had equipped me with, before you knew it, I defected from the army, and me and my brother formed our own outlaw posse. It was much more profitable than staging raids and ambushes on political rivals. That's where the excitement was. I began fighting against countless bands of Confederate outlaws that crossed over the Virginia line into Harlan County, raiding their camps and stealing their horses, burning barns and homes of Confederate sympathizers. Once, I told a man to open his smokehouse lock for me and my men, and he responded, "I'll die before I give you that key." And to that I replied, "Well, then you shall die." And I blew his entire head off at point-blank range. lived off the land during the war, basically pillaging, plundering, and robbing anything I needed and killing anyone who wouldn't give it to me. Once, I was so hungry that I knocked a cow unconscious, and I cut a portion of its hind leg off while the beast was still alive, and I ate it raw before running the animal, screaming in agony, back into the herd. Before long, we got word that an old friend of mine, Turner-Middleton, and his brother were camped with the Union forces, and my brother and I decided to pay him a little visit. I camped on the side of the main trail behind a hollow log, and my brother hid in an ivy thicket just up the road, knowing that they would be traveling along that road the next day. Now you see, my arm had never fully healed up properly from that bullet those Middleton boys had shot me with, and it was time for a little payback. As he and his brother approached on their horses, I sprang up from the ambush and shot the younger one, crippling him for life, while his other brother bolted up the trail. Within a few moments, I heard my brother's musket sing out, killing the other Middleton boy dead. By the time the war ended, Devil Jim Turner and his brother William had killed several men, committed countless robberies, and were even suspected of burning down the Harlan County Courthouse. The justice system was determined to make them pay for their war crimes, and during the trial, they were both out on bail, and they made it clear that they wouldn't go quietly, as Devil Jim shot and killed the star witness for the state, which just so happened to be the leader of the Middleton clan. Meanwhile, members of Devil Jim's posse stabbed the court clerk to death before firing a pistol 3 times at point-blank range in the judge's face. By some miracle, the gun misfired all 3 times. Members of the Middleton clan offered a $1,000 reward to any man who could kill Devil Jim. But before they could kill him, in 1874, Devil Jim Turner and his brother were both convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. 16 years later, he was pardoned in 1900 after new evidence had shown that the Middleton clan had tried to kill him on several occasions. Yet, it was too late for Devil Jim. He had went to prison a strong mountain man at the age of 48, and he had come out a broken shell of himself at age 64, while his brother had died in prison. The one condition for his release was that he had to leave Kentucky. So he moved all the way to Washington State, and several of his descendants followed him to start a new life. For a man whose life was filled with violence that he inflicted on others, it's probably safe to assume that a bit of karma played a part in his demise. One crisp morning in 1910, as he stood over his wood stove cooking breakfast, the feeble old shell of the preaching outlaw, Devil Jim Turner, suffered a stroke and fell face first into the stove before collapsing to the floor with his clothes on fire. His grandson heard his cries for help, but he was too scared to touch his body and chose instead to run a mile away for help. By the time they returned, it was a gruesome scene indeed, and Devil Jim somehow suffered until the next morning before leaving this earth forever. What about you, my friend? What do you think about the outlaw Devil Jim Turner's life? Let me know in the comments below. Oh, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more true stories on Appalachia's past. Coming in at number 1, the family that murders together stays together. Appalachia's Deadliest Family. Back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you might say Appalachia was a lawless frontier that was ruled by powerful family clans. Sure, there were sheriffs and judges, but they held little authority over the heavily armed Appalachian families that were led by quick-tempered, pistol-carrying, brawny men who would lash out in violence at the drop of a hat. In fact, the law feared these families. By 1910, you might say there were 2 dueling legal systems in these rugged mountains. On one hand, you had outlaw Appalachian justice,
where men took matters into their own hands, and bloodshed was the only way to solve a dispute with another man. On the other hand, the courts were ran by elected politicians and career law officers who tried to impose law and order by arresting lawbreakers and depended on the courts to impose prison sentences. It was only a matter of time before these two systems would clash. And in 1912, they did. And what happened next is still considered the deadliest courtroom shootout in the history of America. And it happened right here in Appalachia. So, with that, my friend, this is the true story of the 1912 Courthouse Massacre. It all started on a Saturday night in the fall of 1911 at a corn-husking gathering in rural Virginia. You see, shucking corn during harvest was a big event in the mountains, and the process could be very work-intensive. Sometimes, a farmer would ease his burden by inviting his neighbors over. All the men and the boys would sit outside and shuck corn, while the women prepared the food. And the girls would help with the food, or they would practice quilting. It was a time of socializing. The boys and the girls loved to play the game Shake the Cat, where they bounced a cat on a quilt. Each of the four corners was held by a girl, and a boy would throw a cat on the quilt while the girls bounced the quilt. And whichever direction the cat ran determined what girl the boy could kiss. Meanwhile, out on the porch, the older boys and men would hold contests to see who could shuck a bushel of corn the fastest. Every now and then, they would find an ear of corn that would have some red in it. It was called a red ear. The tradition was that if a young man discovered a red ear of corn, he could kiss a girl of his choice before dinner that night. Well, a young man named Wesley Edwards discovered a red ear of corn, and he chose to kiss the wrong girl. You see, this girl was being courted by another boy, and that kiss would unfold a series of events that still haunts Appalachia to this very day. Now, Wesley Edwards was a member of one of the most powerful clans in the history of Appalachia, the Allen clan. The Allens had ruled these isolated mountains since the Civil War ended in the 1860s. They had been led by the Confederate Civil War veteran Jerry Allen, who, according to contemporary newspapers, was known for beating men to death with his own fist. Folks feared him, and he had become a leading citizen. That's right, the Allen clan was wealthy. Most of them lived in beautiful houses and owned huge amounts of land, and owned successful general stores. Now, they were into politics too. They were proud, unreconstructed Southern Democrats in an otherwise largely Republican county. Most of the Allen family had held office, and for 50 years, they were known as Appalachian Outlaws who settled disputes with fists and guns. By 1910, the patriarch of the clan was 54-year-old Floyd Allen, who was one of Jerry Allen's 7 children. Floyd was an imposing man with a bushy mustache who made his living as a shopkeeper and a farmer, and he was what you would expect of a leader of a clan. He was beloved by many, yet hated by others. He was known for both generosity and a quick temper. Floyd Allen had a long history of altercations with the law, but he had always gotten off with light sentences because of his political connections. For example, in 1904, he had been convicted of shooting his neighbor in a land dispute. Well, for that assault, the jury sentenced him to a $100 fine and 1 hour in jail. These type of sentences were common because folks feared the Allens would kill the judge or the jury if they convicted him. After Floyd Allen received a 1-hour jail sentence for shooting his neighbor, the Virginia governor, Andrew Jackson, pardoned him, and Floyd forced the man that he shot to pay the $100 fine or he'd shoot him again. In another altercation, Floyd and his brother Jack got into a shouting match over a dispute over their father's estate. Floyd shot Jack in the head, but the bullet bounced off of his skull. In return, Jack shot Floyd in the chest. Floyd fell back on a mattress, bleeding to death, when suddenly Jack felt sorry for him and he put down his gun.
Floyd promptly pulled a pistol from underneath the mattress and emptied every bullet into his brother's chest. When he ran out of bullets, he got up and pistol whipped him. Floyd nearly died from the chest wound, but he eventually recovered. Most folks said that Floyd was just too mean to die. In his long life of violence, he had been shot 13 times in fights. Now, when Floyd shot his brother, he was again sentenced to a $100 fine and 1 hour in jail, but he just simply refused to go. Floyd bragged that he would never spend a minute in jail as long as the blood flowed through his veins. In fact, newspapers of the time claimed that the Allen family often boasted that no member of the Allen clan would ever see jail time. You see, it was a matter of family pride. The Allens even had federal officials scared of them. Once, a federal revenue agent showed Floyd a warrant to search his wagon for illegal moonshine. Upon inspecting the warrant, Floyd was reported to have said, "This paper entitles you to go into that wagon, but it don't say nothing about you coming out alive." Fearing for his life, the federal agent took the hint and left. Despite his record of lawlessness, Floyd Allen had been often deputized by the local law, and even in that role, there were many complaints against him for beating prisoners, nearly to death, who had tried to escape while he was their deputy. Simply put, Floyd Allen was one of the meanest, most violent men in a family of violent outlaws. They were untouchable. Everybody feared them. And the boy who kissed that girl at the corn shucking was Wesley Edwards, the nephew of Floyd Allen. The very next day after the corn shucking, during church services, Wesley Edwards ran into the boyfriend of the girl he kissed the night before. Now, that boy was furious, and he confronted Wesley. But as soon as church was over, Wesley and his brother took out their pistols. Then they took turns beating him nearly to death. Both of them were charged with felony assault and interfering with the worship service. Now, when Wesley's uncle Floyd Allen heard about the charges, he was furious, and he told the boys to hide out in North Carolina, where they couldn't be arrested, until he could make the officials drop the charges. However, a sheriff had a warrant drawn up, and they arrested the boys and ordered them extradited back. They hog-tied the boys up and tied them to the back of the wagon and began bringing them back to Virginia. Now, coincidentally, it just so happened that the road back into town passed right in front of Floyd Allen's house. When Floyd saw his nephews tied up like hogs, he demanded that they be released. But the deputies refused, and you see, that was a mistake. Floyd just promptly took out his pistol and beat the hell out of both of them. And then he simply untied his nephews. The next day, Floyd took both boys to court where they were convicted and served short sentences. However, Floyd now had a bigger problem. He himself was facing assault charges and illegal rescue of prisoners. It seems the sheriff and the local politicians had had enough of his vigilante justice, and now was the time to prove once and for all that they were the law of the land, not the powerful Allen clan. So you see, on March 13th, 1912, Floyd Allen found himself in court yet again for felony assault. This time, he was convicted on all charges and ordered to return to court the next day for sentencing. Word spread quickly throughout the town, and everybody knew there was sure to be trouble the next day. Heck, that evening, someone delivered a handwritten note to the judge that said, if Floyd is put in jail, they would kill the judge before sunset. The morning of March 14th, the entire town was on edge. Everybody knew something was looming. Every court official and every law enforcement officer in the building was carrying a pistol at the hearing. But so was the entire Allen clan, who were standing in the back of the courtroom, armed to the teeth. That's right, the entire courtroom was locked and loaded. Now, what happens next is still debated to this very day. But One thing is for certain. It would become the deadliest day in the history of the United States justice system. Floyd was seated in the defendant's chair in the middle of the courtroom when the lead juror read this sentence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Floyd Allen, guilty on all charges and recommend a $1,000 fine and 1 year in prison. A hush fell over the courtroom. Floyd slowly stood to his feet and he looked at the judge and he said, "Well, gentlemen, I ain't a-going." Nobody knows who fired the first shot, but all hell broke loose, and the bullets began flying from all directions. In the next 90 seconds, gunfire rang out like thunder. Floyd was one of the first people shot, and he fell to the ground on top of his lawyer, who told him, "They're going to kill me, shooting at you." Meanwhile, eyewitnesses said that the Allen clan stood at the back of the courtroom, firing pistols like Custer's cavalrymen at the Battle of Little Bighorn. They shot the jury foreman dead. The sheriff was shot 5 times and killed. The prosecuting attorney was killed. A 19-year-old onlooker was shot and killed, and the judge was shot dead right in his seat. Chaos broke out as folks ran for their lives. Floyd, who was already shot, pulled out a concealed pistol and he joined the battle. 7 other people were shot as the violence spilled out of the courtroom onto the lawn of the courthouse. The Allens took refuge behind a Confederate statue and they reloaded and continued the assault. Floyd's hip was shattered from a gunshot, but he managed to escape the courthouse where he was shot again by the court clerk. This time, shattered his knee. Although he was immobilized, Floyd continued firing back, and the court clerk was shot. All told, 5 people were dead and 7 more injured. Floyd was too badly injured to travel, so he hid out in a hotel, while the rest of the Allen clan escaped on horses. When they began pulling the dead bodies out of the courtroom, witnesses found a handwritten note still in the judge's pocket that read, "If you sentence Floyd Allen to jail, you'll be dead before sundown." Now, folks, that wasn't a threat. That was a fulfilled promise. 90 seconds of carnage left 57 bullet holes in the walls of the courtroom and the stairs leading out of the courthouse. Heck, 2 bullet holes in the courthouse steps are still there to this very day. The shootout made the front page of nearly every newspaper in the world. For the first time, the violence of Appalachian outlaws captivated the entire nation's attention as a nationwide manhunt ensued. Every member of the Allen clan was wanted, dead or alive. Now, the next morning, law enforcement captured Floyd at a nearby hotel since he was so badly wounded. When the cops burst into his room, Floyd was out of bullets, so he took a knife and tried to slit his own throat before being arrested. But catching the rest of the Allen clan would prove to be much more difficult. Several Allens hid in the mountains while others headed west. It would take months to catch them all. The last 2 Allens were finally caught 10 months later in Iowa. Ironically, the last Allen to be caught was Wesley Edwards, the man who had found the red ear of corn and planted the kiss that started it all. This event became known throughout the world as the Courthouse Massacre of 1912. It was front-page news throughout the world for 30 days before another tragedy captured the world's attention when the Titanic struck an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean and sank.